Chapter 1856. His expression was a little stunned. She knew that he had given up and pursed her lips. "You said you wanted me to accompany you?" His fingers stroked her red lips gently and he smiled. "You'll be afraid." "I'm not afraid." She hugged his slim waist and buried her face in it. She murmured, "Anlin, I'm not afraid." She even pulled him to her side and hugged him like a child. "See, I'm not afraid. Aren't you afraid even if you turn off the lights?" His voice was hoarse. His voice was damaged and not as elegant as it used to be. She shook her head vigorously. "I'm not afraid, really." She kissed the side of his body. "It's not perfect, but it's real." He had no idea how much she longed for this warmth. When she went to the morgue, the cold, dead air made her afraid. And the cemetery, she had not been there many times. Perhaps, from the bottom of her heart, she was not willing to accept the fact that he had died. Fortunately, he was back. Her Anlin was back. There were tears in her eyes as she looked at him emotionally. "Anlin, when I said that I wanted to feel your presence, I wasn't just saying it. I really want to hug you. I want to make sure that you are alive, and not just a cold body like you were back then. I was afraid that this was a dream. I was afraid that I would wake up from this dream. Hug me, and I won't be afraid." Perhaps it was because of the desire in her eyes, he slowly leaned against the headboard and hugged her gently. He still wore a thick silk nightgown, trying his best not to expose his body at all. He even wanted to wear a mask. She stopped him. She didn't want him to do this. She held his fingers tightly with both hands. She leaned into his arms and kissed him like a little cub. Her little teeth bit open the strap of his pajamas. He was shocked. "Liang Qiu. What did she want to do?" He held his pajamas like a girl who had been raped. She laughed and her voice was very delicate. "Anlin, I want to hug you." He understood what she meant and closed his eyes slightly. "Isn't this enough?" "Liang Qiu, give me some time." His voice was indescribably fragile. After a long time, he did not receive any response from her. He slowly opened his eyes, thinking that she was angry. When he opened his eyes, he saw her giggling, her chin resting on his chest and her fingers playing with his chin. "Anlin, when did you become so chaste?" His expression froze and he patted her. "All right, it's time to sleep. Behave yourself." "Oh," Jiunshu let out a long sigh. She reached out and turned off the lights. His voice was light. "Liang Qiu, are you sure?" She nodded and buried her face in his arms. "I'm not afraid. You're Anlin. Why would I be afraid?" For a moment, Qin Anlin didn't know what to say. It seemed that he was touched, but she just couldn't feel moved. She was sometimes in the wind and sometimes in the rain. She was no longer the cold Liang Qiu from before. He seemed to have become more mischievous. He didn't feel good in his heart. He hugged her and sank into the long night. In the middle of the night, Liang Qiu did not fall asleep. She looked up in his arms. The moonlight was like water, illuminating the whole bedroom. It was quite beautiful. But this did not include her Anlin. His face was incomplete. She cared. She cared a lot. Because he had become like this, because he had used his life to exchange for hers. Chapter 1857. Anlin sacrificed everything for her to be in good condition. She wanted to do something for him, to avenge him, but the enemy was dead. She could do nothing. To be good to him, to make it up to him. She could only use her whole life. She couldn't hurt his pride. What she cared about was actually different from what he cared about. But they were both for each other. Her fingers gently stroked his face. She wasn't a fool. They had been together for so many years. It wasn't just his face. Tonight he didn't want her. Even after being in contact for so long, she didn't feel his desire. She thought she knew what was wrong with him. She didn't dare to ask. If she did, he would leave. Men treated this as important as their lives. Even if she didn't care, it would still affect their lives. Because he cared a lot. She put herself in his arms, feeling his presence. "Anlin, as long as you are alive, I don't care about anything, really." She murmured and fell asleep. Early in the morning when she woke up, he was no longer in bed. Outside, it seemed to be his voice and a woman's voice. Was it his secretary? Liang Qiu leaned slightly, thinking quietly. A beautiful secretary. If she went back to be city, would he go back? And if he went back, would his beautiful secretary follow him? She didn't ask about these last night, and she didn't dare to ask. They did recognize each other, but everything was different now. She wasn't that optimistic. Thinking about this, she got up. Her bathrobe was loose on her shoulders, and her hair was also lazy. She didn't even wear shoes. She walked all the way to his office. It was very bright and she could smell the coffee. He couldn't have made it because he always liked to order others around. His beautiful secretary was not only an assistant but also took care of his daily life. Then, did the secretary lie on the bed she slept on last night? Qin Anlin was wearing an expensive handmade suit and a mask, standing in front of the floor-to-ceiling window and talking on the phone. Yi Liangqiu walked over, and her soft body wrapped around him from behind. She didn't say anything, just hugged him. He was on the phone, and he knew that she wouldn't mess around, so he just patted her hand, signaling her to finish as soon as possible. However, he still overestimated his understanding of her. 2 minutes later, she got impatient and bit him from behind. He was in pain, and the muscles on his back were all tangled up. She reached out and poked him, smiling happily. Qin Anlin turned his head as he answered the phone and watched her get up in the morning. The weather was fine. Holding the phone in one hand, he picked her up with the other and walked straight to his desk. Placing her on it, he absent-mindedly spoke in French and began torturing her with his other hand. Or it should be called punishment. Not only did she not stop him, she even bit her lips and became even more presumptuous. An office was even more secretive than a bedroom, and it could even evoke some evil thoughts. In the end, she was a mess, moaning and begging him. He didn't know if she should beg him to stop or put down the phone and focus. Just as the temperature was rising, the office door was pushed open, and Zhang Yuanyuan looked inside in confusion. A woman, a very beautiful woman, was only wearing a bathrobe, sitting on her boss's desk, and her boss's hand. Chapter 1858. He had always been very exclusive. Or did he need women? Zhang Yuanyuan said in a sharp voice, "Why are you here?" The woman on the desk was probably too slutty, so her intuition told her that she was a prostitute. Yi Liangqiu said lazily, "Why can't we be here?" Qin Anlin frowned. "Get out." Zhang Yuanyuan smiled triumphantly. "Boss, how much is the check?" Yi Liangqiu smiled lazily. "I don't want to leave him no matter how much it costs. What should I do?" As she spoke, she charmingly rested her face on Qin Anlin's shoulder and looked at Zhang Yuanyuan with a smile. Zhang Yuanyuan felt deeply insulted. She was a highly educated girl. Since when did she need to deal with such a prostitute? She was about to lose her temper when she suddenly felt that the woman in front of her, who was only wearing a bathrobe, looked familiar. Zhang Yuanyuan couldn't help but gasp when she took a closer look. It turned out to be Yi Liangqiu. How could it be Yi Liangqiu? Why can't it be me? Yi Liangqiu put her face on the table and smiled. If she was a vixen just now, she was an angel now. Zhang Yuanyuan was embarrassed. She pursed her lips and said, "This is the office. Isn't it inappropriate for Miss Yi to act like this?" She took out the aura of a professional and stared at Yi Liangqiu. Yi Liangqiu smiled and looked at Zhang Yuanyuan. "But Anlin likes it?" Qin Anlin was speechless at her nonsense. Liangqiu hadn't been like this before. He raised his hand and gestured for Zhang Yuanyuan to leave first. Although Zhang Yuanyuan was unwilling, there was nothing she could do. When the office door was closed, Yi Liangqiu looked up at Qin Anlin. "Your secretary is very beautiful." There was a little dissatisfaction in her tone. Qin Anlin smiled. "Liangqiu, you weren't so childish before." "You didn't use a female secretary in the past," she replied quickly, glaring at him. At this moment, his hand was already on her shoulder. Hearing her words, he let go. "Go in and change your clothes. I'll send you back in a while." His voice was calm, unlike last night. Yi Liangqiu stared at his face as if she was trying to decipher the meaning of his words. After a long time, she tightened her bathrobe and asked softly, "Anlin, what about you? Aren't you coming back with me?" Qin Anlin reached out to stroke her long hair and sighed. "Come and accompany me when you're free." Although it was tactful, it was very clear that he did not want to go back. He probably guessed what she wanted to say and sighed again. Liang Qiu, I'm afraid of scaring the child. She froze. She stared at him for a long time and then smiled. I know, Anlin. She did not force him. After saying one more sentence, she turned around and walked towards the bedroom. But her footsteps and the sound of the door slamming did not mean that she was in a good mood. Qin Anlin stood there. The morning light outside shone on his silver mask, making him look a little mysterious and also a little ridiculous. His heart was a little pale. He turned around and looked out of the French windows. Sometimes, getting and losing were the same pain, the same dilemma. What should I do, Liang Qiu? Now that we've met, it's hard to go back to the past. Can you accept me, child? Chapter 1859. We sleep together every night. You want me? How should I tell you that I can't satisfy you? After a while, she came out in a new set of clothes. It was his. I'm leaving first, she said softly. She didn't stay as thick-skinned as she had the night before. He turned his head and looked at her clothes. He was stunned for a moment, but in the end he didn't say anything and just grunted. Yi Liangqiu looked at him. Qin Anlin, I might not come back. He grunted again. Qin Anlin, I'm going to marry Du Yuesheng when I get back to City B, she said fiercely. This time he spoke with a faint smile. Didn't Du Yuesheng sleep with Linda? How are you going to marry her? She kicked him angrily and quickly walked out. Qin Anlin grabbed her arm and said in a low voice, Liang Qiu, stop it. He hugged her from behind and pressed his face against hers. She felt the coldness of the mask and her heart slowly calmed down. She was indeed angry, but it didn't mean that she couldn't think for him. She didn't say anything and listened to him. Liang Qiu, is this okay for now? He murmured. I didn't consider skin grafting before because half of my body was destroyed. Now, at least let me fix my face, okay? He half begged, give me time. Her body softened. She turned around in his arms and looked up at him. Anlin, am I being too willful? He smiled. I allow the child's mother to be willful. She blushed slightly and pushed him away. Don't give me that. I don't believe you. Even so, even though she knew that he was hesitating, she still gave in. She had to give in. Qin Anlin asked someone to send her back. Zhang Yuanyuan opened the car door for her in the parking lot. She paused for a moment and said, Miss Yi, I don't think you know that the boss is now king, not Qin Anlin. I think he's happier being king. Outsiders don't need to interfere in the affairs between us husband and wife. Yi Liangqiu's voice was slightly cold. Zhang Yuanyuan chuckled. Really? If you're so confident, why doesn't King go back with you? She looked straight at Yi Liangqiu. People change. Miss Yi knows better than me whether he's happy or not. I just want to tell Miss Yi that people shouldn't be too selfish. Yi Liangqiu's heart skipped a beat. He pursed his lips and got into the car. Leaning against the back seat, she closed her eyes. Although Zhang Yuanyuan's words were selfish, they were not without reason. If he went back, would Anlin be happy? She was indeed a little too selfish. She brought him along to face everything. He let out a long sigh. His heart was in a mess. After Zhang Yuanyuan sent him off, she returned to her office on the top floor. As soon as she opened the door, she saw Qin Anlin sitting on the sofa smoking. The whole office was filled with smoke, and it was very choking. Zhang Yuanyuan immediately opened the window. Boss, Miss Yi is already in the car. Qin Anlin nodded and didn't respond much. Zhang Yuanyuan hesitated for a long time before she plucked up her courage. Will you go back to City B? Qin Anlin looked up at her and smiled faintly. Perhaps. New York is more suitable for you. Zhang Yuanyuan blurted out. Qin Anlin didn't move. He looked at her deeply and said self-mockingly, You mean that New York is more suitable for a man with a ruined face, right? Zhang Yuanyuan shook her head. Chapter 1860. Miss Zhang, I think you're thinking too much. Qin Anlin's voice suddenly turned cold. There are no personal feelings between us. He paused for a moment. Please respect my wife next time you see her, or we won't be able to work together. Zhang Yuanyuan was stunned because of his ruthlessness. She thought that he always had some special feelings for her, because she had seen his most private side. She was the only one who used this office besides him. She would even take care of his daily life. It wasn't an exaggeration to say that she was half a wife. That was why she had the confidence to say that in front of Yi Liangqiu. Now he was saying it like this? It was as if nothing had happened. Zhang Yuanyuan couldn't take it anymore and said with difficulty, "King, I thought I had a chance. We got along well before, didn't we?" She thought about it and even said, "I know you and she are divorced. I'm not the third party, am I?" Qin Anlin pressed the cigarette butt in his hand and looked at her. He said calmly, "I've always treated you as a business partner. It's because she's back, isn't it?" Zhang Yuanyuan's voice was a little sharp. "That's why you rejected me and denied everything I did for you before." Qin Anlin's gaze was deep. After a moment he took off the mask on his face. The silver light glided past, revealing half of his face. He exposed himself in front of her and looked at her stunned expression. He laughed self-deprecatingly. "Now, do you still want to say what you just said?" Yes, she had taken care of him. She had done what she should and shouldn't have done. He didn't reject her because in some ways, Zhang Yuanyuan was like Liangqiu. But now, she wasn't like him. Liangqiu wouldn't show such a shocked and hurt expression. She would only hug him and tell him that she didn't mind. That was very character and not ugly at all. Qin Anlin put the mask back on and looked at Zhang Yuanyuan, who was still in a daze. He said calmly, "Let's go out first." Zhang Yuanyuan came back to her senses and looked at Qin Anlin. She said instinctively, "King, I'm not." But no matter how much he tried to defend himself, it was futile. After watching for a long time, she finally left. When he walked out, his legs were still trembling. He was still a little shocked. It was too scary, too scary. She really didn't know if she should continue. Qin Anlin got up, picked up his phone, and dialed a number. After a while, he got up, took his coat, and walked out. Zhang Yuanyuan looked down, not daring to ask where he was going. 2 hours later, Qin Anlin was lying on the examination table of a private hospital. Keim also came over. Keim talked to the doctor, and then his eyes fell on Qin Anlin. He was a little surprised. President Qin had been quite resistant before. Why was he willing to have skin grafts now? After the examination, Qin Anlin slowly sat up and spoke to Dr. York in fluent English. "How many times do you need?" Dr. York smiled. "It should be less than 8 times. Keim frowned and looked at Qin Anlin. But Qin Anlin didn't mind. He nodded and made an appointment with Dr. York. After leaving the hospital, in the car, Keim looked sideways and asked, "When will President Qin be admitted to the hospital?" Qin Anlin smiled faintly. "Next week." Keim nodded. "Okay, I'll make the arrangements." Qin Anlin smiled faintly and didn't say anything else. Keim would definitely tell Yi Liangqiu. Chapter 1861. He thought that Liangqiu would be happy. He wanted to make her happy. Sure enough, not long after Keim left, her call came. "Anlin, I don't mind." Her voice was light and gentle, with the gentleness of a wife. Qin Anlin smiled and said after a while, "Liangqiu, I just want to be able to go out with you in the day and walk on the street together, instead of being with you at night with a mask on." Although it was a normal sentence, it was like the most touching words of love in the world. In her heart, there was an indescribable tenderness and gentleness. After a while, she said, "I'll go with you." His words dispelled her uneasiness about whether he was happy or not. She thought that she still cared about him. Qin Anlin's heart softened a little. He had been lonely for a long time, staying alone in that plain and white place for a long time. In fact, he was a little repulsed by that kind of place. But now, she said that she would go with him. He mimicked her and said, "Yes," softly. Yi Liangqiu smiled, and so did he. "I'll come over after you coax the baby tonight?" she said softly, as if she was afraid that he would reject her. He froze for a moment, and his whole body tensed up because of this. He longed for her so much. He longed for her and was afraid at the same time. He didn't know where he got the courage from. Maybe it was because the way Zhang Yuanyuan looked at him was different from how she looked at him. One was an inexplicably infatuated look, and the other was his wife. She was his wife after all. "Come with me early, I'll cook for you," he said softly. He hadn't cooked for a long time, let alone for a woman. At one time he had given up on himself and life, and just lived numbly. But now, life was alive again, the world was colorful, and those doctors weren't so annoying anymore. That was how they felt when they reunited after a long time. His appearance wasn't that important to her, but she wanted him to be happy. If plastic surgery could make him happier by her side, she would support it. It might be painful, but she would be with him. It was already 10 p.m. when Yi Liangqiu arrived at his place. She had driven herself and called him before entering the elevator. As soon as the elevator door opened, he stood there waiting for her. In his hand, there was a bouquet of white roses. She was pleasantly surprised. She held it in her arms and took a deep sniff. She raised her head and asked, "Where did you buy this?" His lips curled into a smile. "I ordered it over the phone. Do you like it?" She said sweetly that she liked it, then wrapped her arms around his arm. "Anlin, what did you prepare for dinner?" As soon as she finished speaking, she went into a daze. The food in front of him was comparable to a 5-star meal. The floor-to-ceiling windows were filled with red roses, and a long dining table was set in silence. Silver candles were lit. There was a silver-colored utensil placed on the table. It was impossible to see what it was, but Qin Yi could smell its fragrance. "You made this?" Like a little girl, she pressed her face against his arm. "Anlin, what should I do? I feel like I'm stealing glances at you." He looked down at her. "You mean my face?" She giggled. "Yeah." Qin Anlin pinched her face and smiled. "How about you try it?" He helped her sit down, and he sat on the other side. Yi Liangqiu was dressed in a long white dress. Her long, curly hair fell on her shoulders, and she looked beautiful. She was very happy, as though she was dreaming. Chapter 1862. Qin Anlin was wearing a white shirt. Other than the silver mask, he didn't have any gloves on. He didn't hide anything in front of her. It was probably because of her warm gaze that he didn't avoid it. Yi Liangqiu took the lid off the utensils and exclaimed, "Wow, it's great." He nodded lightly. "I should nourish you." As he said that, his gaze swept over somewhere. Yi Liangqiu glanced at him and started to dig into the thick soup he made happily. It tasted delicious. Yi Liangqiu licked his lips as he ate. His face was full of satisfaction. "Anlin, you're too amazing. As long as you like it." He smiled faintly. Half of his face was still handsome. They ate quietly. Even if they didn't speak, it was still moving. She was very full. After the meal, she sat on the floor in front of the French window and leaned against his chest. "Anlin, I haven't eaten so much in a long time. You fed me like a little pig." As she said that, she tilted her head and smiled at him, smiling like a little girl. Qin Anlin's gaze deepened. "Hey, it's good to be fatter. If you don't look so good, there won't be so many people fighting with me for you." She nestled against his shoulder and watched the night with him. His body temperature was warm and she was reluctant to part with it. Even if she didn't do anything, she would still feel satisfied. "It's been a tough year, hasn't it?" he asked suddenly. Yi Liangqiu was stunned for a moment. Then she smiled faintly. "Anlin, I thought you wouldn't ask." He smiled faintly. "Why wouldn't I ask?" His fingers closed around hers, his injured hand. She was stunned for a moment. Then she reached out and touched his palm. Because of the injury, there were no palm lines. That hand wouldn't look good. But these injuries were because of her, because he was protecting her. She didn't think it was ugly at all. "It wasn't too tough. I found out later that you were still alive." She buried her face in his neck and said softly, "I was just worried." "Anlin, I know the situation is good. You won't hide it from me." She took a deep breath before continuing. "I told myself countless times that I believed you would come back." This was the only way she could continue waiting. Only then could she wait for his return amidst that hopeless despair. She said in a low voice. He did not feel good in his heart. After a long time, he said in a hoarse voice, "I will come back. You still pushed me to do yuesheng." she said with dissatisfaction, causing him to chuckle. Liang Qiu, you see, you and him are not fated to be together. Even without me, just Linda alone is enough to make it impossible for you to be together with him. He sighed, and there was a hint of mockery in his voice. In fact, her and Du Yuesheng's outcome could not be changed, but her actions had changed Du Yuesheng and Linda's outcome. Yi Liangqiu rolled her eyes at him. What's the use of saying that now? If I hadn't been faithful, do you think we would have met in New York? Qin Anlin sighed. Liangqiu, do you blame me? Her gaze was like water under the moonlight. She looked at him for a long time without saying a word. His heart sank. Anlin, how could I blame you? She said faintly, I'm just afraid that you won't come back. Her fingers wrapped around his waist. I'm not joking with you. If you leave again, I'll find a man to marry or leave you. We'll split the 5 children. His face darkened. Why don't you split the family assets? Split the children? She really dared to say it. Yi Liangqiu giggled. Because the family assets are all under my name. Chapter 1863. Upon hearing her words, Qin Anlin glared at her, looking as if he didn't know what to do with her. She looked at him and smiled lightly. She buried her face into his chest and laughed gloatingly. Anlin, have you ever regretted it? He hugged her. Are you talking about King Entertainment or my face? Your love for me, she asked shamelessly. Qin Anlin chuckled and reached out to pinch her face. Why would I regret it? Loving you is the one thing I will never regret in my life. She looked up and her whole body was soft. Really? Qin Anlin sat and bent one knee, letting her lie in his arms. She looked up and her long, beautiful fingers landed on his mask. She said softly, Anlin, can you take off the mask? He lowered his head. His dark eyes were dark as he looked at her deeply. His voice trembled slightly. Don't you think it's ugly? She only smiled lightly. She hooked her arms around his neck and kissed him lightly. At first, it was just a light kiss, but later on, her eyes moved because of this kiss, and the kiss deepened. As the two of them were gasping for breath, Yi Liangqiu gently took off his mask, brought it up to his lips, and kissed him even more fervently. Qin Anlin kissed her back. Their lips and tongues were glued together and they didn't separate for a long time. In the end, he finally withdrew. He was still kissing her lightly, and there was a hint of a smile in his voice. Liangqiu, you really have a heavy taste? She punched him angrily and then buried her face in his chest. The night was very quiet. It was wonderful as they leaned against each other. On the top floor of the tallest building on Wall Street, they hugged each other like a beauty and a beast. But no one could understand the love between them. The night was a little chilly. Qin Anlin's legs were sore from sitting. He looked down at her. She had already fallen asleep. She was sleeping in his arms. She really wasn't afraid of his face at all. Qin Anlin originally wanted to carry her to bed, but now he was a little reluctant. He just sat there without moving and looked at her with a deep gaze. Yi Liangqiu woke up after taking a nap for an hour. When she opened her eyes, she saw that he was staring at her. She smiled and hugged his neck. Anlin, I want to sleep. His voice was deep as he hummed in agreement. He bent his body and carried her to the bed in the bedroom. She fell onto the soft bed and refused to let go of him. Her voice was very soft. Anlin, I want you to accompany me. His gaze was deep, and he coaxed her with a husky voice. Oh! He helped her take off her dress and change into her pajamas, but he lay down with his clothes on and let her rest in his arms. The more he acted this way, the more she clung to him. Her slender arms wrapped around his waist, and she said in a low voice, Anlin, I won't let you go. He was helpless. He kissed her and coaxed a child. Okay, I won't go. She became even more clingy. She unbuttoned 2 buttons of his shirt and pressed her face against his chest. Qin Anlin couldn't help but say, Liangqiu, you weren't like this in the past. How did she become so clingy? You used to hug me even tighter than you are now. She complained and yawned. Anlin, let's sleep. I have to go back to feed the baby tomorrow. When she said that, he thought of something. She was going to feed the baby tomorrow morning. If she didn't eat the food tonight, wouldn't it be a waste? She closed her eyes and couldn't see the green light in his eyes. Chapter 1864. Yi Bingqiu woke up immediately. She hugged his black head with both hands and looked down. Her forehead was sweating and her voice was trembling slightly. Anlin. He reached out a hand to comfort her and continued to do the shameful thing. About 10 minutes later, he lifted his head from her arms and stroked her red lips gently. Does it feel good? Yi Liangqiu glared at him. She could not care less about her embarrassment and kicked him hard. Qin Anlin was in pain from the kick. He let out a muffled groan and chuckled. He reached out and tidied her pajamas slowly. He even said shamelessly, "It's quite sweet." Yi Liangqiu closed her eyes slightly. The hair on her forehead was already wet with sweat. She hummed softly. "I'll wean Anlin Lan tomorrow." "How can I do that?" Qin Anlin lay down again and comforted her carefully. Yi Liangqiu looked up at him. "You'll eat me up even if I don't." His dark eyes became focused and even the back of his eyes felt a little hot. She then realized that she had said something inappropriate. She snorted softly. "Shameless." Qin Anlin was still chuckling. "Yes, but I can't guarantee that I won't do it next time." He liked that soft feeling as if he had found a place to belong, and this was a very weak thought, so he would not tell her. Yi Liangqiu wrapped her arms around his waist and closed her eyes. "Anlin, let's sleep. You're not allowed to lose sleep." He laughed. What a domineering little thing. She did not even allow this. How could he control her? He stroked her lips gently with his fingers and patted her, coaxing her to sleep. The curtains were not drawn. Outside the floor-to-ceiling window, there was a dark night sky. He leaned against the headboard and watched her for the whole night. Before Qin Anlin went to the hospital, Yi Liangqiu came every night. They were like lovers who had a secret rendezvous. He cooked for her and she slept with him. They were like a normal married couple, but the only difference was that they did not have a sex life. She did not mention this, and he did not do anything inappropriate to her. The days passed just like that. After the first day, Zhang Yuanyuan did not go to work for 2 days. On the third morning, she went to the office with red eyes. Qin Anlin sat on the sofa and smoked while reading the newspaper. Hearing the door open, he looked up at Zhang Yuanyuan. But Zhang Yuanyuan's eyes were red. Qin Anlin grunted indifferently and looked at her. "You've thought it through?" Zhang Yuanyuan was a good partner. Of Zhang Yuanyuan. Zhang Yuanyuan was Zhang. Moreover, he wasn't wearing a mask at this time. He thought it was better for her to give up on this idea. Zhang Yuanyuan looked at his face and dispelled the distracting thoughts in her mind. She nodded lightly. "I've thought it through." "That's good. Take care of the things you left behind in the next 2 days." Qin Anlin's voice was calm. "Also, my wife will come often. You don't have to work overtime." Although she said that she had let go of her feelings, she still couldn't stand him being so straightforward. She felt wronged. Zhang Yuanyuan had never felt that she had such a fragile heart before. She pursed her lips so tightly that they turned white, and then said softly, "Yes?" She couldn't help but ask, "Why don't you go back?" "Go back." Chapter 1865. Qin Anlin reached out to touch his face and smiled. Not everyone is unafraid. Zhang Yuanyuan was stunned and couldn't say a word. Qin Anlin didn't say anything else and focused on reading the newspaper. Zhang Yuanyuan stole a glance at him. She felt relieved when she saw his face. It was right to give up. She wasn't great enough to make such a big sacrifice for a man. It was good for them to be reunited as husband and wife. So that night, Yi Liangqiu met Zhang Yuanyuan in the parking lot. Zhang Yuanyuan even gave her a friendly smile. "Hello, Miss Yi. Boss is waiting for you upstairs." Yi Liangqiu closed the car door gently and her eyes were fixed on Zhang Yuanyuan's face. After confirming that she had given up on Qin Anlin, she didn't feel worried or relieved. Instead, she was a little annoyed with this woman. She felt sorry for Anlin. What Zhang Yuanyuan loved back then was power and wealth, not Anlin as a person. When she saw Anlin's face, she gave up decisively. Her behavior was actually very bad, and Anlin had no reason to accept it. However, These were all thoughts in Yi Liangqiu's heart. She didn't show it and just replied calmly, "Got it?" In the elevator, her eyes felt a little hot. But why should Anlin be humiliated by this woman? Yes, this was an insult. This kind of love was not worthy. She pursed her lips and let out a long sigh. She adjusted her emotions before getting out of the elevator. She didn't want Anlin to know what she was thinking. If he did, he would be hurt. When she walked out, he was already waiting for her. She stretched out her hand and let him hold it. When they were alone, he didn't wear a mask anymore and it was natural. She knew how much effort and struggle he had to put up to be so calm in front of her. Her eyes felt a little hot. She held his hand and said softly, "I'm going to the surgery in 2 days. I'll cook tonight." He didn't stop her and took the laptop. "Okay, I have some work to do." She looked at him sitting on the sofa and focused on the computer. From her angle, she could only see half of his face. It was a perfect side profile. She took a deep breath. She thought to herself, she actually owed Enlon. If she hadn't done that back then, his face wouldn't have been like this. She was the one who insisted on having the best of both worlds, but in the end, he was the one who paid the price. She bent down and kissed his forehead lightly. "Don't be so tired." In her heart, she understood him. He had given King Entertainment to her, so he wanted to rebuild his career. Her heart ached, but she didn't stop him. Qin Anlin looked up and kissed her. "Got it?" After she left, a trace of contemplation appeared in his eyes. They had been married for so long, she couldn't hide her thoughts from him. It was obvious that she had such thoughts in her heart. She probably felt that she owed him. He took care of his work for a while, and when he smelled the aroma, he felt hungry. He looked at his watch and saw that it was already 8 o'clock. She eats so late every day. Is she tired and hungry? As he thought to himself, he got up and walked straight to the kitchen. The warm yellow light shone on the top of her hair and her side profile, softening her facial features and expression. She wasn't wearing a dress tonight. Instead, she wore black leggings and a white knit sweater. Chapter 1866. Yi Liangqiu turned her face away. "You only know how to make me happy." He tightened his grip and pressed his entire body against her back, blowing hot air into her ear. "I just want to make you happy." He was getting more and more unruly. She struggled gently and her voice was especially tender. "Anlin, it's done." He refused to let go. After being apart for so long, how could he bear to let go of her when she was so soft and tender in his room? Not only did he hug her from behind, his large palms became more and more unrestrained as he rubbed her and pressed his lips against her soft neck. "How can it be done?" She grunted. "I'm cooking, Anlin." They had been husband and wife for a long time, but it was rare for them to be so relaxed and sweet. At that time, ever since Su Shirching appeared, his entire body had been tense. How many times had she been so soft? He was getting more and more overboard. He hugged her tightly and did not let go. His large palms rubbed her, making her clothes a mess. Yi Liangqiu could not do anything about it. She humphed coquettishly. "Anlin, you can't waste it like this." "Can't waste it?" That seemed to be exactly what he wanted. He chuckled softly. Just like what she wanted, she couldn't waste it, right? He reached out and turned off the fire. With a lift of his muscular arm, she was carried onto the cold countertop. She could not escape even if she wanted to because he was holding her in place. "Anlin." She called out his name softly. Her eyes were a little watery with a hint of reproach. His fingers caressed her red lips and his gaze was deep. Be good. She did not want to be good. He did not know that she could not take it when he did that. Her slender fingers hugged his head, feeling helpless at the feeling of being out of control. He was really too much. She started to cry and kicked his shoulder. She was a little willful. "Anlin, don't do this. Don't do this." She cried and begged him. He clearly knew that she would, but he still bullied her. He was so bad. He moved his lips to hers and kissed her. Seeing that she was really crying too hard, he felt a little heartache. After all, she was a normal woman. He was really too much to treat her like this. His eyes darkened. He carried her up and walked towards the bedroom. Yi Liangqiu was stunned. She lowered her gaze and whispered, Anlin? Her voice was trembling. His voice was very hoarse. He kissed her, rubbed her, and carried her to his bedroom. The door was kicked shut, and she was thrown onto the king-sized bed. He held onto her, his fingers interlocked with hers and his lips pressed against her ear. Liangqiu, I've said it before. I'll make you happy. At this moment her mind was in a mess. She looked up into his unfathomable eyes and trembled. He didn't know if it was because he was afraid, but because he was excited. He understood women. In the past, Qin Anlin had been surrounded by flowers, but he had never served a woman. Now, he wanted to make her happy, he wanted to see her intoxicated look. He lowered his head and she screamed, "Anlin, be good, don't move. Feel it well?" He restrained her struggling body, coaxing and comforting her. His lips were warm, but it was enough to set off a storm that sent her into a frenzy. Everything was calm. She looked as though she had been fished out of the water. She reached out and hugged him tightly, like a drowning person hugging onto a piece of driftwood. Qin Anlin allowed her to hug him. He also reached out to pat her, comforting her. She was probably really angry. She had embarrassed herself just now. Chapter 1867. Yi Liangqiu bit his shoulder and said in a low voice, "Qin Anlin, don't do this in the future. Don't you like it?" He kissed her lips and straightened her face. He asked hesitantly, "Or are you uncomfortable?" How could she not be uncomfortable? It was too comfortable. That was why she was afraid. Moreover, she did not want him to be so lowly. He was Qin Anlin. Qin Anlin. In the depths of Yi Liangqiu's heart, he was still the Qin Anlin that she had first met. He was high and mighty and did not care about any woman. However, he became her husband and became like this because of her. Now, he did such a lowly thing to please her. If he was fine, she would find it interesting to see him like this. However, it was different now. She guessed that there was something wrong with his body. The more he behaved like this, the more she could not bear to do it. She reached out and hugged him. "Don't do this in the future. I'm a little scared." His heart was a little wet. "Liangqiu, this is all I can give you. I feel guilty whether you want it or not." He turned to the side and looked away. "Then I won't do it in the future." She looked at his face and guessed what he was thinking. Suddenly, she hugged him again and buried her face in his chest. "Anlin, I like it. I like it very much. It's very comfortable." How could he not know about the changes in her? He sighed in his heart. "Liangqiu, you're getting worse at hiding your feelings." This was probably what it meant by the depth of love and the timidity of love. There were some things that they did not talk about, but both of them understood each other's feelings. They avoided this topic. Their life was very harmonious. Although he did not please her every night, he would often hug her and make her happy. Qin Anlin slowly realized that he seemed to like it very much. Psychologically, he seemed to have obtained some kind of secret satisfaction. Fortunately, he was hospitalized for surgery. The first surgery was relatively big and painful, and it lasted for more than 10 hours. Yi Liangqiu was waiting for him outside the operating room, and Aunt Su was always by the phone. She and Liangqiu had been longing to see Anlin for a long time. Yi Liangqiu had told her that when Anlin's face recovered, all right, when will it be ready? It's not like I haven't seen it before. That time when you were born prematurely, I've also seen how terrible you looked. Crispy Sleeve was old and said, in any case, it wasn't as ugly as Anlin when he was born. Yi Liangqiu was speechless. She didn't know whether she was angry or amused. Recently, she had learned to coax people. Not only did she have to coax Qin Anlin, but she also had to coax Su Xiu. Every hour, Qing Xiu would call to ask about the situation, so Yi Liangqiu did not feel that these 10 hours were unbearable, from morning till late at night. The surgery was finally over. When Qin Anlin was pushed out, his face was covered with gauze. Fortunately, half of his face was still exposed. The anesthesia had worn off, and his face was very painful. Moreover, half of his face was very swollen, and it could be felt under the gauze. Yi Liangqiu looked at it, and her heart ached terribly. She wanted to say that they would not do it next time, but she only thought about it and held back. He wanted to be with the children, and she had to respect him. Other than his face, he also had skin grafted on his hands. In the future, when he wore clothes, he would probably not be able to see the injury. He only looked at her, and reluctantly raised his hand to wipe the tears from her eyes. He squeezed out a smile. Liang Qiu, it doesn't hurt? How could it not hurt? Chapter 1868. But the way he looked at her was filled with love. How could he bear to see her sad? How could he bear to see her sad? If he had known, he wouldn't have gone for the surgery. Qin Anlin closed his eyes. Holding her hand gently, he said softly, Liang Qiu, I'm a little tired. She nodded her head with tears in her eyes. I'll watch over you. I promise I won't leave. His lips curled up slightly. He wasn't a child anymore. How could she coax him like this? By the time he woke up again, it was already 10 hours later. Opening his eyes, they were swollen. In front of him, he could vaguely see Liang Qiu's figure. You're awake? She leaned forward and whispered in his ear, Do you want to sit up? Qin Anlin looked at her. His face was swollen like a pig's head and he couldn't say anything. The moment he spoke, his face would hurt as though his skin was being cut open. His eyelids twitched and she understood. Reaching out, she shook the bed and got him to sit up. He was extremely weak. He knew that his current state was probably even worse than before when he was covered in scars. At least, it wasn't funny before. But now he really couldn't look at it. Liang Qiu bent down and looked at his eyes. She smiled. Anlin, you look really cute now. She was all smiles and he felt that she was extremely detestable. However, teasing him was just teasing him. She still took care of him and fed him water. He pursed his lips while she said softly, slowly. Just as he finished speaking, he looked at her with a profound gaze. Liang Qiu's delicate body trembled under his gaze. His pig-head face was simply too seeping, and he was saying such ambiguous words. What are you thinking about? She glanced at him. After feeding him water, she placed the cup aside and pulled up the blanket for him. Auntie Sue will send porridge over later. You can't eat stimulating food. You have to go light for a week. You'll be fine after the swelling subsides. Qin Anlin's face was hurting. He didn't say anything and just looked at her. Liang Qiu knew that he wanted to ask about the children. I'll take care of Kaim at home. Don't worry. She smiled faintly. Actually, Anlin, your face is completely covered now, but the children can see you. She swore that she really didn't mean to laugh at him, but the narrow-minded man was obviously angry. Liang Qiu smiled. Actually, Anlin was like a child sometimes. He didn't object, so Liang Qiu called Kaim and asked him to come with Aunt Sue. There were 2 adults and 4 children, so Kaim had to drive a commercial car to accommodate them. While waiting for the others, Qin Anlin took another nap. When he woke up, the morning sun shone on his face, stinging him slightly. Liang Qiu was lying on the side of the bed. Only then did he remember that she hadn't slept the whole night. He felt sorry for her. At this time, the swelling on his face was a little better. Although it was still swollen, it was not as painful as before. He touched her body gently with his fingers and Liang Qiu woke up instantly. Anlin, how are you? He shook his head gently and didn't say a word. She knew that he was feeling sorry for her. She smiled faintly, her slender fingers caressing his ear. Lan, this really isn't much. Compared to the pain he had suffered, it was not even 1 in 10,000. He didn't say anything else but held her fingers gently. It was already 9 in the morning when Kaim brought the children over. Chapter 1869. Not only was young Madam capable, but she was also good at giving birth. She had given birth to 5 children for the Qin family. Although 1 had gone to the Tang family, there were still 4 left. Originally, Liang Qiu was going to feed Qin Anlin, but Qing Xiu chased her aside. I'll feed them. After you finish your milk, give birth to the children. The 2 little guys haven't eaten for the whole night, so they're not in a good mood now. Qin Anlin sat for a while and looked at the 4 little buns with a burning gaze. Momo, Mumu, and Anlin were all pink. He couldn't get tired of them no matter how he looked at them. especially the two little ones. He hadn't seen them before. Qingxiu carried a chair over to feed them and chuckled. We'll see them in the future. First of all, young master, you have to take care of yourself. Qingxiu looked up and felt that this gauze was a good thing. It blocked the young master's face, as if it was blocking his self-esteem. Otherwise, Anlin wouldn't know how long he would have to wait to see his father. Qingxiu thought happily that she should let the young master wear gauze all the time in the future. That way he would be at ease. However, this was just Qingxiu's random thoughts. That wouldn't do. His skin still needed to be ventilated. Qin Anlin pursed his lips lightly. He ate very slowly, and also ate very little. It really hurt to move his mouth. The four babies looked at him from the opposite side. The little one was very small. He lay down and only knew how to eat his fingers. Momo and Mumu were already 2 years old. They had been separated from Qin Anlin for a long time. Now that their heads were wrapped like this, they really couldn't recognize them. Qingxiu was very happy and took care of Qin Anlin as a young master. She even introduced him happily. This is Daddy, remember? Momo and Mumu refused in their hearts. How could this man, who was wrapped like a pig's head, be their handsome father? They didn't believe it. The two little ones continued to play with the two little buns. Qingxiu sighed. Just as she was about to say something, Qin Anlin stopped her. Aunt Qingxiu, it's good enough that they're not afraid. Let's talk about it later. Su Xiu's gaze landed on his face. She felt that it was difficult to explain in a few words. She sighed softly and didn't say anything else. After Yi Liangqiu finished eating, she carried Anlin Lan into the inner room to feed him. Qin Anlin stared at her back for a moment longer than necessary. Actually, in his current state, he needed more nutrition than Anlin. Qin Anlin stayed in the hospital. Before the stitches were removed, Kaim and Qingxiu often brought the children over. After a few times, the children were used to Qin Anlin's pig face wrapped in gauze. Momo and Mumu had even begun to call him Dad. When Qin Anlin was in good spirits, he would play building blocks with them. Time was so good that Qin Anlin would rather stay in the hospital for the rest of his life. When he said this to Yi Liangqiu, she knocked his forehead. Unless you're willing to be a pig's head for the rest of your life. Qin Anlin snorted. He felt that she was not as cold as before. However, life was just like this, and it was also very good. It was so good that sometimes when he woke up in the middle of the night and looked at her face lying on the side, he felt so happy that it didn't seem real. However, after he removed the stitches, the children could no longer come to see him. A week later, he was discharged from the hospital and moved into a villa. Yi Liangqiu also moved to the villa next door because it was convenient for her to run around. After feeding the children, they arrived through the small door in the middle. Kaim also moved in with Qin Anlin. This was probably Qin Anlin's dark thoughts. Chapter 1870. Just as he was feeling a little depressed, the door to the study room opened. Yi Liangqiu carefully closed the door and walked in. It's already so late. His tone was indifferent, but he showed his dissatisfaction. When she came closer, he pulled her over and placed her on his lap to kiss her. After spending time together for a while, their relationship had warmed up a lot. It was not as stiff as before, and he would kiss her whenever he wanted to. She had always been gentle and obedient, allowing him to kiss her. When he was almost done kissing her, he let go of her. His forehead was still pressed against hers, and his voice was hoarser than usual. Why are you so late? His large palm pressed on her back, and he exerted force so that she could fit into his embrace to the greatest extent. Yi Liangqiu placed her hand on his shoulder and kissed his chin. The child is a little slow in eating. His face was smoother after the stitches were removed. But now, it looked like a patch and it did not look good. Moreover, Yi Liangqiu thought about how his face was transplanted with skin. She felt that if she were to kiss that side of his face again in the future, it would be a little indescribable. She sighed in her heart. It was better to kiss the other side. Qin Anlin's large palm caressed her, and his voice became deeper. Is there more? She really could not stand his shamelessness and punched him. Doesn't your lips hurt? His stitches had just been removed, and it would hurt even when he was eating. But now, he had to suck as hard as he could like Anlin. Yi Liangqiu did not understand the dark thoughts of these men. She felt that it was not like he had never done this before. Why was he so infatuated with it? However, she could not stop Qin Anlin from doing what he wanted to do. He sat behind the study table and hugged her. In the end, it was not convenient, so he carried her onto the study table. After kissing for a while, she shamelessly snatched Anlin's food. But she still felt that it was not enough, so she simply tore everything off and shamelessly did some things. The wooden desk contrasted with her skin, making it look particularly seductive. His blood was boiling and he did many things that were out of line. When the deed was done, he leaned against her neck and panted. Yi Liangqiu's condition wasn't much better. She angrily bit his shoulder. "You don't like me treating you like this?" He chuckled huskily. He helped her up with one hand and adjusted her clothes with the other. At this moment, he cherished her incomparably. In fact, he also knew in his heart that using such a method was somewhat unfair to her. He also knew that he had to go to the doctor eventually. A marriage without sex would not last long. Fortunately, they were not married yet. They were only ex-husband and ex-wife. He stared at her for a while and patted her back. "Shall I carry you to the bath?" His face couldn't touch the water yet, so she could only wash alone. After washing, he would carry her out. He had been injured before, but fortunately his strength had recovered. Taking care of her was not a problem, but there were some places where he could not use his strength, and he felt a little uncomfortable. When he carried her into the bathroom, she bit his ear and whispered, "Anlin, I want to kiss you." Qin Anlin smiled faintly. He lowered his head and kissed her lips. After kissing for a long time, her face was red. It was not because of the kiss, but because she buried her face in his neck. After a while, her lips moved to his ear, and her voice was as soft as a mosquito. "Anlin, I'm not talking about here." His body was obviously tense as he looked at her deeply. After a while, he found his voice. "If it's not here, then where?" Chapter 1871. She came out of the shower without calling him. She was wearing a bathrobe and her long hair was let down, which made her look especially soft. She walked to the bedroom and dimmed the lights. Qin Anlin leaned against the headboard and watched her come out. His gaze was deep. Yi Liangqiu smiled faintly. She didn't say anything and lay down beside him. "Where do you want to kiss?" Qin Anlin changed his position and lay flat on his back. He looked at the ceiling and warned her, "Liangqiu, this body is no longer like before. Are you sure you want to do this?" Only God knew that he had never dared to think about other things. As long as she didn't despise him, as long as she could let him kiss and hug her, and if he could recover in the future, he would do everything. She could just close her eyes and enjoy it. He didn't dare to think that one day, she would be able to serve him like he did. It was really a wonderful thing that fell from the sky. He still couldn't believe it when he thought about it. Yi Liangqiu hugged his waist and looked up. She asked softly, "Anlin, can I really do it anywhere?" His jaw tightened. There were too many wild thoughts in his mind. He didn't make a sound. She had already started kissing him, from top to bottom, not missing a single spot. Sensing her intention, he suddenly grabbed her arm and pressed her waist. "Liangqiu, Anlin, you don't want to?" Her voice was also trembling. His Adam's apple moved a few times and his eyes were gloomy. "You won't want to see it. There was also a burn there. It wouldn't look good." Yi Liangqiu pushed his hand away firmly. She pressed her lips against his and murmured, "Anlin, I've said it before. I want everything." Everything to him. Whether it was good or bad, she would accept it. This was also a psychological barrier that he had to overcome. Qin Anlin's body froze. He suddenly sat up straight and his voice was a few degrees colder. He wasn't as emotional as before. "Liangqiu, give me time." She was pushed to the side and fell to the ground, looking a little embarrassed. Only then did he realize that his actions were a little rude. His gaze softened a little and he said hoarsely, "I'm sorry." He picked up the bathrobe from the side and helped her put it on. After tying the knot, he looked at her silently for a long time. He got out of bed and went out wearing only a pair of trousers. Yi Liangqiu sat there and waited for a long time, but he didn't come back. Hugging himself, he felt a little cold. He didn't come back, so she just sat there hugging herself. Qin Anlin stayed outside for about an hour and smoked 5 or 6 cigarettes. When he returned to the bedroom, she was still sitting there. His heart ached. "Why aren't you sleeping?" He stepped forward, wanting to hug her and lay her down. However, as soon as he touched her, he realized that her body was very cold. He closed his eyes. "Liangqiu, give me time to face it, okay? Whatever I can give you, I can give it to you. Whatever I can't, I'll work hard." He thought that she was angry and wanted to coax her. However, she raised her eyes and looked at him anxiously. Then she dove into his arms and wrapped her slender arms around his waist. She said in a low and nasal voice, "Anlin, I'm sorry." He was a little surprised. "Don't ignore me." She buried her face in his lower abdomen. After a while, he felt warm and wet. It was her tears. He couldn't do anything about it. He reached for a tissue and wiped her tears. "Why are you crying?" Chapter 1872. She buried herself in his arms like a little girl, crying and refusing to speak. He was in a dilemma and couldn't do anything about it, so he kept coaxing her. He didn't know if she had given birth to too many children. Wasn't it said that once a child was pregnant, she would be dumb for 3 years? She had given birth to 5 children. How long would she stay dumb for? But he thought he is selfish, he would rather she continue to be stupid, so that he can selfishly have her. After crying for a long time, he finally coaxed her. He even decided to let her kiss him. She could kiss or even bite him as long as she was happy. However, the little girl refused and wouldn't let him touch her no matter how much she cried. Qin Anlin waited for her to fall asleep and rubbed his forehead. He had a headache. Do all women like to cry like this? He remembered she didn't cry like this before. She didn't cry like this even when he had sex with her for the first time. But it was interesting. Qin Anlin lay beside her and looked at her exquisite face. He couldn't bear to sleep. The next day, when Yi Liangqiu woke up, it was 10 o'clock. He wasn't in bed. She turned over and bit her fingers. It was past the time to feed the baby, so she would go back after lunch. Lying on the bed, she looked sideways. There was no love breakfast, and there was no rose by the bedside. She was dissatisfied and thought of last night. Actually, she was a little shameless. He was angry, so she could only cry. It was quite effective. She used to think that Qin Anlin hated women crying, but he felt sorry for her last night. Thinking of this, Yi Liangqiu was in a good mood again. She changed her clothes and was about to go downstairs when she heard a woman's voice. It was Zhang Yuan. She gave up the clothes in her hands and put on the bathrobe. She loosened the collar to show off to her former rival. Zhang Yuan was reporting to Qin Anlin with the report. He didn't wear a mask, so half of his patched face was exposed. The wound on his face had slowly healed, and he didn't look so funny anymore. Inadvertently, she could see a shadow of the old Qin Anlin. Zhang Yuan's gaze occasionally fell on her boss's face. She was a little confused. Actually, it was only his first surgery. It wouldn't change much, but it wasn't scary anymore. Moreover, Qin Anlin was a dedicated and capable man, very attractive to women. At the very least, Zhang Yuan's heart had loosened, and she had taken a few more glances at him. Qin Anlin was a man, so he wasn't so meticulous. However, Yi Liangqiu saw through his thoughts. Standing on the stairs, he coughed lightly. "Miss Zhang?" Zhang Yuan looked up and froze when she saw Yi Liangqiu in a bathrobe. She lived here? Talking about business? Yi Liangqiu's voice was a little soft. Of course, she was looking at Qin Anlin as she said, "I'm so hungry. Can you cook for me first?" Qin Anlin closed the document without thinking and got up. Zhang Yuan immediately said, "Boss, it's almost over." Otherwise, before she could finish, Yi Liangqiu's fingers were on Qin Anlin's back. She said with a faint smile, "Miss Zhang, this is not the office. Your boss is not a machine. He also has a private life." And she was Qin Anlin's private life. Chapter 1873. In the past, Xia Mian had pestered Hua Mian with all her dirty tricks, but she still got rid of her. Zhang Yuanyuan was obviously a spoiled girl who had never been emotionally scarred. She couldn't hide the things in her heart at all. Yi Liangqiu dealt with her like a toy. However, if Zhang Yuanyuan stayed quiet and worked as an assistant, Hua Mian wouldn't make things difficult for her. Zhang Yuanyuan looked at Yi Liangqiu and felt angry. This woman saw through her mind and didn't give her any leeway. Aside from finance, Zhang Yuanyuan also studied law. In her heart, she always felt that Yi Liangqiu and Qin Anlin were no longer husband and wife. So what if they had a child? If they weren't husband and wife, they weren't husband and wife. Before they got married again, she still had the opportunity to compete with Qin Anlin. Zhang Yuanyuan chuckled and closed the file. I wonder if I'll have the chance to taste the boss's cooking. Yi Liangqiu froze. She didn't expect Zhang Yuanyuan to be so thick-skinned. Didn't she understand such an obvious warning? But she immediately understood that Zhang Yuanyuan's attitude was that she wouldn't back down and would be stubborn to the end. Yi Liangqiu narrowed her eyes and looked at Qin Anlin beside her. He was the one who caused this. It used to be Xia Mian, and now it was Zhang Yuanyuan. Qin Anlin shrugged, a little mocking at her narrow-mindedness. He dared to mock her. Yi Liangqiu was angry. She didn't know why she was so petty. She wasn't like this before. She put on her bathrobe and went back to her villa, leaving the man and woman alone. She left, and Qin Anlin didn't stop her. He looked at her back with a deep gaze. He didn't want to intensify the conflict. In fact, Liangqiu's emotions were a little extreme. He knew that she was thinking about Xia Mian and the uncomfortable past. But Zhang Yuanyuan and Xia Mian were different. Zhang Yuanyuan was a girl with integrity. She was a little willful, but not crazy like Xia Mian. Once a person has a lot of things, they are afraid of losing them. Compared with Xia Mian, Zhang Yuanyuan was much better off. She wouldn't easily give up what she had to pursue something that was far from her grasp. The reason why he didn't stop Liangqiu was that he wanted to solve Zhang Yuanyuan's problem himself. Boss, you have a misunderstanding with Miss Yi. Why don't you go after her? Zhang Yuanyuan's voice was very considerate, while observing Qin Anlin's expression. She admitted that she was testing Yi Liangqiu a little. If Yi Liangqiu continued to misunderstand, that would be great. This was also what she hoped for. Qin Anlin retracted his gaze and looked at her indifferently. Then, he said softly, I think Miss Zhang knows best why my wife is angry. Zhang Yuanyuan's face was a little pale. She didn't understand what Qin Anlin meant. It was clear that Yi Liangqiu didn't see the big picture and threw a tantrum. But why wasn't he angry? Because she is the person I love. No matter what she does, I can tolerate it. Qin Anlin held his forehead. Secretary Zhang, I remember I told you that I will never love anyone except her in this life. Zhang Yuanyuan's voice was a little shaky. What if she doesn't love you anymore? After she finished asking, she waited for his answer uneasily. Qin Anlin smiled. I love her even if she doesn't love me. Zhang Yuanyuan covered her face. Is she really that good? She was such a narrow-minded woman. Chapter 1874. After Qin Anlin said that, Zhang Yuanyuan's heart died. Even if Yi Liangqiu didn't love him, he could remain the same. She didn't understand why a man like him would be so infatuated with a woman. She heard that his injury was because of Yi Liangqiu. That woman was so capricious that she didn't care how much he sacrificed. Is she really that good? Zhang Yuanyuan's voice was bitter, with a hint of reluctance. Qin Anlin's tone was very calm. Not that good, but I like her. Yes, if he liked her, it wouldn't matter if she was good or not. Zhang Yuanyuan didn't understand. Her thinking was too one-sided. She always thought too simply. She only saw Qin Anlin's sacrifice for Yi Liangqiu, but she didn't see Yi Liangqiu's unwavering loyalty. While she was in a daze, Qin Anlin's tone was very calm. Don't come over for the time being. If there's anything, wait for me in the office. But boss, you won't be going to the company for the time being, Zhang Yuanyuan replied quickly. She knew that he was probably doing it for Yi Liangqiu. Qin Anlin's tone became even more calm. Then don't worry about the company for the time being. I'll give you half a year off. Half a year off? Zhang Yuanyuan was even more stunned. Did the boss not want his career anymore? Was he giving up everything just because of Yi Liangqiu's feelings? After a long pause, Zhang Yuanyuan asked cautiously, "Are you going back to B City?" Qin Anlin's gaze fell on her face. Yes. In fact, he was also preparing to focus on B City. King Entertainment was the Qin family's business, so he trusted Liangqiu to take care of it. He was already a non-existent person in the public eye. He could handle his own business at home and still take care of his child. This was the plan Qin Anlin had for himself, but he wouldn't easily say it to an outsider like Zhang Yuanyuan. Moreover, her thoughts weren't pure, so it wasn't suitable for her to stay by his side. His firm answer made Zhang Yuanyuan guess what he was thinking, and her eyes dimmed. She thought she would have a chance, although she hadn't thought it through yet. "Miss Zhang, you don't like me as much as you think." Qin Anlin's tone was very calm. "Don't make things difficult for others and yourself. Don't mess up your life." His gaze was a little gentle as he looked at her. He didn't want to embarrass her too much. After all, she used to follow him and could be considered a very good partner. Zhang Yuanyuan's heart trembled. She felt embarrassed that she had been seen through. That was exactly what she thought. She smiled weakly and looked up at him. "Am I too unkind?" Qin Anlin didn't answer her question directly. He just smiled faintly. "Sometimes it's better to be selfish. At least treat yourself better." Unlike his silly Liangqiu, who had silently done so much for him and endured so much, but when he suffered a little injury, her heart ached terribly. "Are you sure it's just a little injury?" Zhang Yuanyuan's heart was a little sour. He didn't love her, didn't like her at all, but he still gave her a hint of gentleness. She knew that it was because she was his subordinate. Tears welled up in her eyes. She told herself that she really had to let it go. "Boss, if you need an assistant in B City, you must look for me. No one is more suitable than me." Qin Anlin smiled warmly. "Okay." Chapter 1875. In Zhang Yuanyuan's heart, she was finally sure that she should give up. Even the slightest bit of desire seemed ridiculous. She chuckled. "Then I'll be leaving first. You, please coax Ms. Yi and apologize for me." Qin Anlin's voice was a little hoarse as he laughed. "She's not angry at you, she's angry at me." Zhang Yuanyuan forced a smile. After all, she had just fallen out of love. "Then I'll be leaving first. Boss, do I get paid for the half-year holiday?" Qin Anlin's slender fingers landed on the documents and he said mildly, "You can use the company's liquid funds yourself." Zhang Yuanyuan was stunned. Wasn't that too generous? There was still more than $100 million in the account. Was he really going to let her use the funds? However, this was still a good opportunity that others couldn't get even if they begged for it. She should cherish it. She took a deep breath and suppressed the ecstasy in her heart. "Thank you, boss." Qin Anlin raised his hand and gestured for her to leave first. Zhang Yuanyuan naturally wouldn't stay and be the third wheel. After she left, the villa was quiet. Qin Anlin was having a headache because the little woman was obviously angry. He had to coax her now. He obviously couldn't go to her villa like this. Qin Anlin thought for a while and decided to call her. He dialed her cell phone and got through, but she didn't pick up. If she didn't pick up, he would call again and again, until she picked up. Yi Liangqiu's voice was lazy and a little hoarse. "Mr. King, why are you calling me? I thought you were going to entertain your beautiful secretary now." He couldn't help but laugh. He unbuttoned a button on his shirt and said gently, "Then should I find an ugly secretary in the future?" Yi Liangqiu snorted. "I don't care if you find an ugly or beautiful one. Mr. King, let's stop here." She was very petty and willful, not at all like Yi Liangqiu. Qin Anlin chuckled. "Really? You won't regret it?" She was angry with him. "I'll take the child back to B City tomorrow. I won't be an eyesore to you." "Back to B City?" He frowned. She didn't say it would be so soon, but he didn't ask again. Instead, he said softly, "I'm going to cook in a while." Let's have dinner together in an hour, okay? Not good. She displayed her willfulness to the extreme and even hung up on him. After hanging up, a faint smile appeared on her lips. It seemed that she had never lost her temper with him before. She had never acted like a little woman. Would Anlin think that she was too pretentious? Or should he call back now to test the waters? However, she was just thinking about it. After all, she was Yi Liangqiu. She wouldn't do such a lowly thing. Thus, he went about his business with a peace of mind. Qin Anlin stared at his phone for a long time before he burst into laughter. Her temper was growing, but she was still cute. In a good mood, she went to make a table of her favorite dishes. By the time she finished, it was already 12 o'clock. Qin Anlin dialed her cell phone again, but it was switched off. He threw his cell phone down and stood by the sofa, rubbing his hands. He was secretly amused. They were an old couple and had actually had many more intense arguments, but they had never had such a small quarrel. Liangqiu had become smaller. Chapter 1876. Qin Anlin knew her and the children's schedule. Usually, at this time, she would feed the children first, then eat and take a nap. He knew it very well. He walked to the second floor and looked at the passage next door. It was closed by a door that couldn't be opened and had to be locked. He took the key and held it in his hand. He didn't eat and stayed up until 1 o'clock in the afternoon. The children should be asleep, and she should be by their side. He held the key, walked to the door in the corridor, opened it, and pushed it open carefully, afraid that he would wake the children up from their nap. It wouldn't be fun if he woke them up. As he expected, Momo, Mumu, Anlin, and Lon were all sleeping soundly. They all smelled like milk. He was so envious. Yi Liangqiu closed her eyes and felt a little sleepy. At this moment, the sound of footsteps woke her up. When she opened her eyes, she saw Qin Anlin standing by the bed, looking at her with a burning gaze. Because she had fed the children, her clothes were not buttoned up, and she looked very unpresentable. There were 4 soft buns sleeping beside her. That scene softened his heart. Qin Anlin narrowed his eyes and looked at her with a burning gaze. When he spoke, his voice was also extremely hoarse. "Come over and eat with me." Yi Liangqiu reached out and slowly buttoned up her shirt. "I've eaten." Then she deliberately annoyed him. "Didn't Zhang Yuan eat with you?" He didn't get angry. He quietly got onto the bed and crawled toward her. He supported himself with his hands and hung above her. She left first. Then he giggled again. "Why would I want her to accompany me?" Yi Liangqiu was afraid that he would do something stupid, so she lay straight and looked at the patched half of her face. She smiled wickedly. "She refused to accompany you, huh?" She played with the buttons of his shirt with her fingers and looked at him wickedly. Qin Anlin looked at her with a burning gaze. He knew in his heart that Liangqiu really didn't care about his appearance. Did she not look at him or did she not care? Actually, it wasn't important. The most important thing was, damn it, he's been checked out. He's had an injury there and needs an operation. As a man, he did not want her to accompany him for the surgery. Because it was too embarrassing. Qin Anlin's fingers gently pinched her face. At first, it was gentle, but later he really felt that she was annoying, so he used a little more force. She let out a soft cry of pain. He was delighted. He lowered his head and bit her earlobe. "Liangqiu, why do you sound like a virgin?" His fingers loosened as he played a trick on her. Yi Liangqiu glanced at him with tears in her eyes. She raised her hand and pushed him gently. "Go. Don't wake the baby." Not only did he not leave, but he also lowered his body and hugged her shamelessly. Yi Liangqiu looked around. "Anlin, you'll wake them up." His big palms were no longer well behaved. He even kissed her beautiful neck and moved up slowly. His voice was extremely seductive. "So, you have to lower your voice?" Yi Liangqiu's voice was trembling. Her fingers grabbed his shoulders. "Anlin, don't mess around. Then I'll do it properly, huh?" As he kissed her, he murmured, "You're messing around with me because you want me to coax you. Now, are you satisfied?" She glared at him with tears in her eyes. "Satisfied, my foot." She tried her best not to cry out. She clenched her fists and hammered his shoulders. Damn it. Chapter 1877. Qin Anlin had taken advantage of her, but it wasn't enough. When she collapsed, he reached out to pick her up and walked straight to his side. Child. Her forehead was full of sweat. Her fingers tugged at his sleeves and her eyes were slightly closed. Her voice was weak. Qin Anlin lowered his head and kissed her. I'll get Kaim to come over and take care of you. She glared at him. Kaim usually stayed at his place, but he often brought her over. Hence, Kaim stayed here more often. She clenched her fingers and lifted her body slightly. She bit down hard on his neck indignantly. Qin Anlin was in pain. She bit his wound. Although it was painful, he felt an indescribable tenderness in his heart. His Liangqiu really didn't mind that he was ugly. Good baby, I'll feed you again later, he said shamelessly as he lowered his head and kissed her passionately. Yi Liangqiu blushed. He had never said such mushy words in the past. She wasn't used to it. Looking at her burying her face in his arms, he knew what she was thinking. He laughed hoarsely. Because our Liangqiu has become small now, so we have to dote on her like a baby? There were many contradictions in his heart. He wasn't complete and he couldn't give her everything, but he greedily wanted to have all of her. Yi Liangqiu's face turned even redder. She turned to the side and scolded, shameless. Her expression was a little shy, but it was extremely moving. He held her in his arms and couldn't bear to let her go. He kissed her again and again, calling her little darling and sweetheart. She couldn't bear to listen to him anymore. She covered her ears, unwilling to listen. But the more she acted like this, the more he teased her. When they returned to his villa, he didn't eat immediately. Instead, he pressed her down on the sofa and kept kissing her. She looked down at his dark head helplessly. Anlin ate it all just now. His head was still buried as he busied himself. His voice was somewhat muffled as he said, "Then, leave some for me in the future." She tugged at his black hair, trying to pull him up, but her scalp was nearly torn off. He was still buried there, still frantically eating things that did not exist. Yi Liangqiu was a little helpless. She really didn't know why he had such an obsession. When he said that she had shrunk, he was clearly the one who had shrunk. Qin Anlin finally gave up. He climbed over and kissed her neck. He chuckled and said, "Then Anlin will break up in 6 months?" Yi Liangqiu nodded softly. "That's true. There's not much nutrition in the back, so I don't feel bloated sometimes." She really wanted to talk to him about children, but she had underestimated men's deep-rooted bad habits. Qin Anlin and she were not on the same channel at all. He continued in a low voice with a deep smile, "When the time comes, I can help you." Her eyes widened as she immediately understood what he meant. He was too shameless. She glared at him while he was in a particularly good mood. "Our Liangqiu is actually very sweet." Her face was completely red. He really had no integrity. Qin Anlin kissed her for a long while more before pinching her little face. "All right, eat with me." She slapped his hand away. "Your hand is so dirty." He was using his hand just now, and he didn't even wash it afterward. Qin Anlin smiled, his eyes deep with meaning. "Very sweet." Chapter 1878. It was embarrassing for him to do this in broad daylight. Even though they had done it countless times, she was still not used to it. She pursed her lips and gritted her teeth. "Qin Anlin." He hugged her and kissed her. "Yeah, I'm here." She didn't dare to provoke him anymore and ate with him obediently. Even though she had eaten, he still fed her quite a lot of food, saying that it was to nourish her, but how could she not know his dark thoughts? After eating, she made a fuss and wanted to leave. "I've eaten. I'm going back to sleep." She played with the buttons of her pajamas and played with her long hair. Qin Anlin's fingers were on her waist. "Sleep with me." She looked at him. "Qin Anlin, you're very clingy now. Do you know that?" He still looked like a rascal. "Yi Liangqiu, you chased me from B City to New York. Who else should I be clingy if not you? Your little secretary and B City's harem." She snorted in jealousy. Qin Anlin chuckled and caressed her red lips. You're so jealous. But didn't you chase them away? Besides, in his current state, other than hugging and kissing her, what else could he do? However, Qin Anlin was quite happy that his woman cared about him. He kissed her. Since there are no other women, I'll reluctantly accept you. She glared at him and pinched his face. Cheeky. But he didn't control his strength well and let out a low cry. Yi Liangqiu was also shocked. She immediately asked, Did I hurt you, Anlin? He wasn't a virgin. But he was quite good at acting. Yeah, I pinched the wound. She felt extremely guilty and immediately struggled to get down, but he hugged her and wouldn't let go. She had no choice but to stay in his arms and examine it for him. She looked carefully to see if there were any cracks in the patches. After looking for a long time, it was fine. Maybe it's inside, he said calmly. Help me blow it. It might be better if it's a little warmer. She really lay there breathing softly, trying to make him feel better. As he blew on it, he said worriedly, If it still hurts, I'll accompany you to the hospital later. She was always worried. This patch hurt just by looking at it. As soon as she finished speaking, she felt a burning gaze on her. Raising her eyes, she saw him glaring at her as though he wanted to devour her. Her heart skipped a beat as she asked cautiously, Anlin, does it still hurt? He suddenly grabbed her hand and placed it on his chest. Yes, it still hurts. She was about to cry. Qin Anlin's gaze became more profound. Good girl, blow some more. Obediently, she knelt in front of him and blew for him. Her pajamas were low-necked, and he could see the boundless spring scenery from where he was, but she didn't notice it at all. Qin Anlin's heart was burning hot. If it got any hotter, he wouldn't be able to contain any more. He grabbed her hand and pulled her into his arms again, hugging her tightly. His chin rested on her hair and his voice was slightly hoarse. All right, Liangqiu. It doesn't hurt anymore. Really? Her hands quietly hugged his waist. She guessed that he was putting on an act just now. But now that he wasn't hurting anymore, she couldn't get angry. Because she would be happier if he wasn't hurting anymore. Chapter 1879. He replied. She raised her face and looked at his patched face. She said seriously, Okay, Anlin? Qin Anlin smiled faintly and replied very seriously, All right. She hugged him again and said in a low voice with a hint of sobbing, Anlin, you don't know how scared I am. He didn't say anything and hugged her. She was finally crying. Finally, she was crying so weakly. He had always known that she had been in so much pain. When he was lying down, he could hear her heart-wrenching cries in the corridor of the hospital. At that time, she must have gone crazy. But now that they were reunited, she was calm and he was uneasy. Now, she finally let go of everything and admitted her fear. Liangqiu, I'm here. Don't be afraid, I'm alive and well. He comforted her and patted her back. Her voice was choked. You're so bad, scaring me again. You don't know how scared I was at that time. If it wasn't for the child, I don't think I would have survived. She didn't tell him that she was pregnant and was dealing with his funeral. At that time, she was in a bad situation and the child was almost gone. Because she couldn't eat, she would spit it out after a mouthful. But with tears in her eyes, she endured the pain and climbed back to the dining table to continue eating. Every mouthful of food she ate was for survival and for the child in her stomach. Otherwise, she didn't know how she would have survived. Qin Anlin hugged her tightly. I know, Liangqiu. Baby, don't cry. I'm still here, alive and well. She hugged him tightly and said shamelessly, But you're different. You got hurt so badly because of me. That was another layer of her heartache. She was too self-righteous. When Qin Anlin heard her heartache, his heart ached as well. Because of her pain, his heart ached. Alright, don't cry. I don't blame you. He kissed her eyes. Liangqiu, the past is in the past. Sometimes, the truth isn't that important. What's important is that I'm by your side. He kissed her repeatedly to convince her and himself. There had always been a secret between them. It was about his mother's death. Only Liangqiu knew the truth. However, he also knew. When he was locked up with Qin Pei told him. At that time he was shocked. At that time, he realized that Liang Qiu had done all this to protect him. Not only his life, but also his pride. She was too stupid. He knew, but he pretended not to know. Only in this way could they be happy and make her feel better. Look, Qin Anlin loves Yi Liang Qiu, no less than Yi Liang Qiu loves Qin Anlin. He hoped that when she was old, she would think of their past and think that he was a good husband. Anlin, don't scare me like this in the future. Her voice was as aggrieved as that of a child. Actually, she knew that she was a little pretentious. However, he doted on her so much that she couldn't be considered cooperative if she didn't do something. Moreover, at that moment she was really sad. He coaxed her for a long time before she stopped crying. However, the two of them were talking so passionately that he couldn't control himself. He pressed her down on the sofa and kissed her again, wanting to do some outrageous things to her. For the first time, she obediently lay in his arms and helped him unbutton his shirt. Anlin, I want to kiss you. She was asking for it again. How annoying. It was so sweet. Chapter 1880. Qin Anlin kept her there until the evening. He let her go back to feed the baby and then asked her to come over. Even though they had patches on their faces, even though they were an old couple, they still looked like they were passionately in love. Or rather, it was even more than that. Only after experiencing separation and loss would they understand the beauty of being together. The night was lingering. She was wearing the same bathrobe as him. She laid her face on his chest and listened to his heartbeat. She was a little sleepy, but she didn't want to sleep because she wanted to feel his presence. She hadn't slept for a long time, and Qin Anlin could naturally feel it. He lowered his voice and said, "Why aren't you sleeping?" "Anlin, I can't sleep." She hugged him tightly and rubbed her face against his chest like a lazy cat. Qin Anlin smiled. "Then do you want me to tell you a story, huh?" She couldn't help but laugh and said, "Anlin, I'm not a child anymore. In my heart you're little Liang Qiu." He kissed her forehead and looked doting. Her heart trembled slightly. She buried herself in his arms and said in a low voice, "Anlin, let's never be separated in this life, okay?" He lowered his head and saw that she was looking up at him carefully. There was a vulnerability in her eyes that broke his heart. His Liang Qiu was brave and vulnerable. "No, how can I bear to let go of you and the child?" He pulled her body up and pressed his cheek against her face. Yi Liang Qiu was stuck to him, his entire body was stuck to him. It was as if his soul had been embedded into his soul, never to be separated again. "Anlin, don't lose me again," she whispered in his ear. "I'm also afraid of the dark." Qin Anlin's heart ached. Thinking of her vulnerability tonight, he hugged her tightly and spent the night comforting her. In the early winter, Yi Liang Qiu returned to B City. A month later, she would come to New York to accompany Qin Anlin for his second surgery. After she left, Qin Anlin quietly entered the hospital and performed a small operation on his corpus cavernosum. The operation was a success. A week later, when Qin Anlin woke up, he saw the reaction he should have. He was in a very good mood. He looked at it for a long time, even though it did not look as good as before with some scars. But in this way, would she feel more comfortable? Qin Anlin removed the stitches and didn't tell Yi Liang Qiu that he flew back to B City one night. His face looked much better. He didn't look out of place with a mask on. Instead, his slender body and long legs were very eye-catching. When he set foot on the land of B City, his eyes felt a little hot. He had been gone for too long. Finally, he was back. Holding the suitcase with his fingers, he got into the taxi. He knew that Liang Qiu and the children were living in the villa now, so he told the driver the address of the apartment. When he arrived, everything was the same as before. There was even a faint fragrance in the air that belonged to her. Qin Anlin put down the suitcase, took a deep breath, and said softly to the air, "I'm back." He came back quietly and didn't intend to disturb her late at night. But he would always miss her. So he dialed her number. It was 10 o'clock at night, and she wouldn't be in a deep sleep. Sure enough, not long after he dialed, she picked up. Her voice was soft. Anlin? Qin Anlin's lips curled up slightly. Liang Qiu, what are you doing? Yes, preparing to take a shower. Her voice was even softer. Chapter 1881. Yi Liangqiu realized what he meant after 2 seconds and shrieked, "You're shameless?" He smiled faintly. When have I ever been shameless, huh? She felt a little warm inside. Even though she couldn't see, her eyes moved when she heard his voice. She wanted to hug him. Anlin, I'm regretting it a little. I shouldn't have returned to City B so early. She said softly, why don't I go back to New York? He had to have his surgery in half a month anyway, so it was better for her to go early. She thought that a small separation was nothing after being apart for so long, but she didn't expect that she would miss him so much after being apart for only a week. Qin Anlin smiled faintly. No need. She was a little disappointed. He didn't want to see her that much. But soon he said, Liang Qiu, I'll come over, okay? She was pleasantly surprised, but she couldn't say it out loud. She only said, Anlin, I'm going to take a shower. The word shower had probably touched a nerve. After putting down the phone, Qin Anlin's expression was very dark. He pursed his lips and fought with himself. In the end, he decided to see her. Liang Qiu had waited for him for so long and traveled so far to see him. Now it was his turn to see her. He took the car key from the drawer in the apartment. Everything here was the same as before, and he could easily find what he wanted. He drove a white Porsche and headed straight to the apartment they had lived in after their marriage. The night was dark. Although his body was a little tired from the long flight, he was extremely excited, because he was about to see her, his wife. His heart was burning, and he wanted to give everything to her. Those dark struggles were actually solved by a small surgery. It was a surprise that he hadn't expected. Tonight, he would give her everything. When he arrived at the villa, he told the guard not to alarm anyone, stopped the car, and got out. It was early winter, and the air was filled with the fragrance of early bloomed plums. It was cold and smelled very nice. It was just like the feeling that Liang Qiu gave people. Qin Anlin's lips curled up slightly as he walked up the stairs to the second floor. Crispy Sleeve lived on the first floor, but the old man had already fallen asleep. Qin Anlin went straight to the master bedroom on the second floor. When he pushed the door open, his fingertips were trembling. Now that he was back here, he had a sense of reality. The door was gently pushed open. The bedroom was mostly dark except for a bedside lamp. However, the light in the bathroom was on, but there was no sound. Qin Anlin slowly closed the door and looked carefully. She found that the living room of the master bedroom had been changed into a baby room. The 4 babies should be placed inside. She could rest well and take care of the children. He went to the nursery to see the children. They were all pink and sleeping soundly. Afraid of waking them up, he only watched for a while before closing the door and taking off his coat as he walked. When he opened the bathroom door, he saw that Liang Qiu had fallen asleep in the bathtub. Under the chandelier, her skin was fair, and her face was pink from the bath. His body instantly tensed up. He walked over to sit on the edge of the bathtub and reached out to test the water temperature. It was already a little cold. He silently calculated in his heart. It took about an hour to get here from the apartment. She had been here for an hour? He frowned slightly, reached out to carry her body, and wrapped her in a bath towel. Yi Liangqiu woke up in his arms and was surprised to see him. Chapter 1882. She recognized him at first glance. She reached out and hugged his neck. Perhaps because she was in a light sleep, her whole body was exceptionally soft. She called out to him softly. Her voice was sweet and soft, with a hint of disbelief. Qin Anlin patted her and said in a hoarse voice, "Why did you fall asleep?" She hugged his neck tightly. "I'm a little tired." Qin Anlin chuckled. "You'll be even more tired later." With that said, he pressed her towards him suggestively. Even through the thick cloth, she could still feel the changes in him. Her fingers around his neck tightened. She buried her face in his neck and said softly, "Anlin?" She did not ask directly. After all, They were sleeping on the same bed. Some things were connected in their hearts. He kissed her little nose gently. I had a small operation when I was alone. I'm all right now. With that said, he had already walked to the bedroom and laid her flat on the soft bed. He bent one leg and half knelt beside her. His fingers gently pulled off the bath towel as he asked her seriously, Liangqiu, do you want to try the effect? She blushed and turned her face to the side. His rough fingers scratched her little face gently. Holding her cheeks with both hands, he kissed her deeply. Tangled and messy, their clothes were scattered all over the floor. Absence makes the heart grow fonder. Moreover, they had not done it for a long time. He was a little rusty, so it was inevitable that he was a little harsh. It was not until 2 in the morning that he let go of her. She cried out in pain and begged for a long time before he was willing to let go of her. After he indulged himself, it was not that his body was satisfied. In fact, his body was far from being satisfied. Instead, there was an indescribable satisfaction in his heart when he saw her being fed to her full. His love for her had long gone beyond receiving, and it was giving. He got up covered in sweat. When he took a hot towel to clean her up, he found that she was bleeding. Qin Anlin's face heated up. He looked at her for a long time with a burning gaze. After hastily cleaning it up, he went to find some ointment and applied it for her. When he lay down again, she was almost asleep. He patted her to coax her to sleep. But after a while, she was full of energy again. She hugged him and asked 100,000 why. Anlin, why did you suddenly come back? She clung to him, and though they were both hot and uncomfortable, they clung to each other. Qin Anlin's heart was filled with tenderness, but he didn't let her go. He chuckled and said, because I want to make love to you. She punched him lightly. Be serious. Qin Anlin chuckled. I'm unemployed now. The most important thing is to satisfy Mr. Yi. As he spoke, he leaned close to her ear and asked meaningfully, how is it? Not bad, right? Yi Liangqiu glanced at him. Unwilling to answer such a shameful question, she buried her face deep into his chest. Not only was it okay, it was practically killing him. She was still hurting there. The way he looked at her, he suddenly turned nasty, forcing her to say something shameless. What kind of person was Yi Liangqiu? She wouldn't say anything even if she was beaten to death. If she didn't say it, he wouldn't let her sleep. In the end, after more than 10 minutes, she blushed and held onto his shoulder. She whispered in his ear, you're better than before. Qin Anlin was satisfied. As long as she was satisfied. Chapter 1883. The night was so long. Even if they couldn't do anything else, they were still curled up. Seeing her fall asleep in his arms, exhausted, Qin Anlin knew that at this moment, he had given her everything. His heart softened and he kissed her. It wasn't until 5:30 that he put on his clothes and left. She didn't wake up. She was probably really tired. When he walked to the door, he turned back and checked. As he looked, his breathing became hot again. He secretly scolded himself, covered her with the blanket and left. When Yi Liangqiu woke up, it was already 8 o'clock. When she opened her eyes, the warm morning sun shone on the room. Aunt Sue was holding the children and feeding them milk one by one. She got up and her voice was a little hoarse. Let me do it. But just as she got up, Aunt Sue's expression became a little complicated. Let me do it. Yi Liangqiu slowly lowered her head and then didn't know whether to laugh or cry. Her arms and mouth were full of hickeys. Aunt Sue's expression must have misunderstood. Yi Liangqiu lifted the blanket and walked towards the bathroom. When she reached the door, she turned back and coughed lightly. Aunt Sue, Anlin is back. He spent the night here last night and should be back to the apartment now. Su Xiu was really shocked. Young master is back? Why did he come back in the middle of the night? And he didn't call anyone. Why was he so sneaky? Her eyes were full of doubts. Yi Liangqiu coughed again. The flight arrived at night. Aunt Sue, you and the babies were asleep, so I didn't wake you up. How could Aunt Sue not understand? A man, driving back and forth so late at night, what was it for? Wasn't it just to hug his wife and do that kind of thing? Looking at young Madame's little face, She must have had a good night last night. Thinking of this, Aunt Sue's heart was a little happy. Maybe the Chin family would have another little miss and young master. But Aunt Sue was thinking too much. Not only did Chin Anlin have an operation, but he also had a vasectomy. Giving birth was too hard and he didn't want Liang Qiu to give birth again. Moreover, they already had enough children. If he gave one to Tang Yu, it would be 4-2. So, last night, he did it so intensely and without any protection. In between, Liang Qiu cried and reminded him, but he kissed her and told her that it was okay, and gave it all to her. What Crispy Sleeve didn't know was that she was very happy in her heart, thinking about a nest of babies. Although Liang Qiu didn't hear Chin Anlin say it directly, she could roughly guess in her heart. They had been separated for too long, and it was not appropriate for them to have another child. She went to take a shower and saw the marks on her body in the mirror. She was angry and amused at the same time. They were no longer teenagers, so why did they have to wear such marks? When he came out of the shower, Aunt Sue had already fed the children. She grumbled, "The sun hasn't even risen and he's already gone." Liang Qiu smiled faintly. "I don't know what time I left either. Aunt Sue was old and liked to nag. At least let me see him. I haven't seen him in a long time." Liang Qiu placed her hand on the back of Crispy Sleeve's hand and smiled faintly. "Then I'll ask him to come back for dinner tonight, okay?" Only then was Crispy Sleeve satisfied and scolded jokingly, "Liang Qiu, you're still the one who dotes on your Aunt Sue, unlike Anlin who has no conscience." As she said that, she sighed. "Actually, I'm old and don't have much time left to live. I always want to see more." Chapter 1884. Liang Qiu wouldn't care about this. Moreover, Su Xiu was so devoted to her and the child. It wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that she had given everything to the Qin family. She had long regarded Su Xiu as a family member and had given up on letting her go back to her hometown to enjoy a happy life. She had told Anlin that the Qin family was Su Xiu's home. No matter how old she was, as long as she was alive, she would still stay in the Qin family. However, she didn't expect that Qin Anlin would also not expect that Su Xiu's life would be so short in the end. It was so short that no one could accept it. Qin Anlin answered Liang Qiu's call and came over at night. There were still shallow patches on his face. He was afraid that the children would see it, so he wore a mask and played with it for a while. Then he asked the servants to bring it upstairs. Only then did he take off his mask to eat. Aunt Sue was overjoyed. She couldn't stop smiling. She made a table full of dishes to welcome Qin Anlin home and had a good reunion dinner. Kaim also came and brought He Huan. He Huan was quite lonely as a child. It was a good time to play with Silent Mumu. The Qin family hadn't been so lively in a long time. They chatted and laughed until late at night. Kaim brought He Huan home. Qin Anlin and Liang Qiu went upstairs to rest. She coaxed the child and returned to the bedroom. Then, she saw Qin Anlin's green eyes. She probably couldn't hide from him tonight. She didn't want to hide either. She sat quietly in front of the dressing table, took off her earrings and combed her long curly hair. In the mirror, his figure appeared. Then, she was gently hugged from behind. "Anlin, you can go take a shower first?" Her voice was very soft. Qin Anlin lowered his voice. "Let's shower together." She thought of the red marks on her body and was a little annoyed. She glared at him in the mirror. "When Aunt Sue saw me like this morning, she thought that I was peeking at home." Qin Anlin chuckled in a low voice. His thin lips were pressed against her neck, and his voice was extremely hot. "How could you fall in love with someone else? Our Liang Qiu is so silly." He kept kissing her until she was a little dazed. She thought back to last night and felt a little unwilling. He was clearly like what Aunt Sue said. His mind was occupied. If he was willing to come back tonight, it was most likely because of what happened on the bed. She bit down hard on his neck. "Don't do that again tonight." "Which is it?" He breathed heavily, deliberately teasing her. "Like this or like this, eh?" The more he kissed, the more inappropriate the place became. In the end, he picked her up and walked straight to the bathroom. Lowering his head, he said shamelessly, "Oh right, Liang Qiu, Didn't you say that you wanted to kiss me there? It was very dreamy for her to be carried in a princess carry, but the words that came out of his mouth were extremely shameless and shameful. She pinched his straight nose with her fingers and looked disgusted. Qin Anlin, why do I feel that it's better if you don't get it up? At least we'll be more harmonious. Unlike now, he simply wanted it all the time. Qin Anlin's voice was a little hoarse. Liangqiu, I've been hungry for too long. Actually, he shouldn't have touched her tonight, but he couldn't help it. He leaned close to her ear and said in a low voice, Liangqiu, why don't you kiss me and I won't move, eh? How could she not know his dark thoughts? He said it nicely, but when the time came, he would not let her off easily even after he had enjoyed it. She would not fall for it. But usually, there were two ways for a man to deal with a woman. One was to be gentle, and the other was to force. Chapter 1885. They were together for the entire night. At dawn, Qin Anlin realized that Su Xiu had left. She left with a smile on her face, and there was no trace of pain on her face. At that time, Qin Anlin had prepared breakfast. He thought it was strange, so he went to Aunt Su's room because Aunt Su had always been the earliest to wake up in the Qin family. At 9 in the morning, she hadn't woken up yet. When the door opened, Qin Anlin paused and looked at Su Xiu's face with a passionate gaze. She had left because her face was ashen and stiff, but there was a cruel smile at the corner of her mouth. Qin Anlin looked at her quietly for a while and slowly walked over. He half-squatted in front of Su Xiu and reached out to smooth her slightly messy hair. He called out softly, Aunt Su, why did you leave just like that? He had just returned last night, and today, she couldn't wait to leave. Could it be that if he hadn't returned last night, she wouldn't have left so quickly? But then he thought, if he hadn't returned, wouldn't he not have been able to see her one last time? He half knelt down and brought his face close to hers. To him, Su Xiu was half a mother, and the role she played in his life was no less than that of his mother. Yi Liangqiu stood at the door, stunned. Anlin. Her voice trembled as she called out his name softly. Qin Anlin glanced over and let out a long breath. Come here and send Aunt Su off. Yi Liangqiu's face was pale as she slowly walked over. She knelt beside Anlin and said softly, Aunt Su has no children, Anlin. He knew what she was going to say. He reached out to hold her hand and said in a low voice, Okay. Su Xiu's funeral was done in a grand manner. Qin Anlin and Yi Liangqiu gave her the most dignity possible. Su Xiu had no children, but she had relatives in her hometown. Qin Anlin brought them over and had them attend Su Xiu's funeral. He also got someone to buy a very beautiful villa for her in her hometown, not for anything else, but just so that she could have a place to stay if she wanted to go home. The drizzle was like silk. Another grave was added to the Qin family's cemetery. Su Xiu's grave was right next to Lady Qin's. Anlin, in the future, Aunt Su can accompany Mom like before. Dressed in black, Yi Liangqiu stood beside Qin Anlin. As she spoke, she put her face on his shoulder and looked at the two graves in front of them. Qin Pei had already been buried with Lady Qin. Their wedding photo was used for the photo. Qin Anlin looked at it for a while and said indifferently, I wasn't there when they took the photo. After so many years, my mother still kept him. She must have loved him very much. Yi Liangqiu pressed her face against his arm and did not make a sound. After returning from Anlin, he did not mention Qin Pei again, and she did not dare to ask. She was even afraid that he would be unhappy if he found out about them being buried together. Was he going to tell her what he thought now? Qin Anlin's voice became deeper and deeper. Liangqiu, my mother died for him. As for him, I can't say that he died for me, but I was born for him. The man he had hated for many years had given him 2 lives, and he no longer had the strength to hate him. His mother wanted to love, so how could he object? Yi Liangqiu smiled lightly. Anlin, I think Aunt Su has been waiting for you to come back. She looked up at him. Because you came back, Aunt Su left in peace. All these years, Aunt Su is very tired. We let her rest well, she said softly. Qin Anlin lowered his head and looked at her deeply. He smiled bitterly. Liang Qiu, are you comforting me? Chapter 1886. He smiled and hugged her. Then comfort me in bed tonight. He stroked his chin and smiled again. It'd be best if I can do whatever I want. Liang Qiu could not do anything about him. She said in a low voice, the three elders are here. How can you be so presumptuous? He was too shameless. He was still so sad just a moment ago. And now, he was full of energy and thinking about sex. Qin Anlin smiled. If I continue to be sad, won't I be letting you down? He hugged her shoulders tightly and said in a deep voice, life is so short. Liang Qiu, I don't want to waste any more time. He lowered his head to look at her. She looked up too. Their eyes met and it was indescribably touching. She thought that she should understand him. The two of them walked toward home. It was not too far, so they just took it as a stroll. One tall and one short, they walked slowly just like that. He did not wear a mask and attracted a lot of attention. He did not care, and neither did she. They walked like an old married couple, heading home. When they passed by the road, a woman carrying a child and a young man were looking at the direction where Qin Anlin and Liang Qiu had gone. Shenrua's eyes were a little hot as she muttered to herself, he's actually still alive. Then she chuckled softly. It was a little strange. It's a pity that his face is like this. She hugged the man tightly and explained indifferently, I met someone I knew. At that moment, she felt a sense of balance in her heart. She felt that God was kind to her. Although her man wasn't as rich as Qin Anlin, his appearance was complete. Shenrua thought like this, but in the dead of the night, she couldn't help but think that she only thought like this to seek a type of self-consolation. Her heart was still filled with indignation. Once, she stood so high and was so close to that outstanding man. They were so close to getting engaged. Fortunately, his face was ruined. When Shenrua calmed down, she would think that way. The more she thought about it, the more comfortable she felt. After a long time, she stopped thinking about it. However, she had never thought that one day, they would meet again. A month after Aunt Sue's death, Liang Qiu returned to the company to work, and Qin Anlin stayed at home to take care of the children. After some discussion, they came to the conclusion that his surgery would be done in the country and they would invite foreign doctors over. Anyway, no matter how big the expenses were, they could afford it. There was really no need for them to travel between the two countries. On the first day he went to the company, Linda had just returned from her vacation. After the meeting, Liang Qiu looked at Linda and asked doubtfully, Linda, do you feel that you seem to have put on weight? Linda's face was especially red. She had just returned from her trip. She pinched her face and said, I seem to have gained a lot of weight. Therefore, she said that she wanted to lose weight. Liang Qiu looked at her and felt a little relieved. Linda gave her the bracelet, and then her eyes turned red. I heard about Aunt Sue. Why didn't you inform me? At least send her off. When they were in New York, Linda and Aunt Sue had a good relationship. At the thought of this, Linda's tears flowed down. Liang Qiu wiped her tears and said lightly, Aunt Sue is usually afraid of troubling people. It's not easy for you to have fun outside. How can I call you back? Chapter 1887. Linda grunted in acknowledgement. She was quite thoughtful. After work, she even bought a bouquet of flowers and said a few words in front of Aunt Sue's grave. Finally, Linda turned her head and said, Mr. Yi, I might have to take a lot of leave in the future. Liang Qiu smiled slowly and said, Didn't you just have a long holiday? The two of them walked towards the car together. Linda stuck out her tongue and said, Mr. Yi, I have to go on a blind date. I have to find a man. Don't be ignorant of the suffering of the starving. The two of them had been through a lot, so they chatted casually. Liang Qiu looked at Linda and said, Do you need something? Linda glanced at her and said, If you need something, you can find a one-night stand. I'm looking for a husband. Liang Qiu smiled and opened the car door. Linda followed. Come to my place for dinner. I'll get the chauffeur to send you back later. Yi Liangqiu's voice was faint. Of course, Linda was willing. She really wanted to have a few babies and had even brought a gift. But she didn't expect to see Du Yuesheng, that old lecher, in Yi Liangqiu's villa. She looked at Yi Liangqiu and then at Du Yuesheng, who was sitting there playing chess with President Qin. She whispered to Yi Liangqiu with a fake smile, "Mr. Yi, previously he was so shameless, crying and shouting that he wanted to marry you. Now that he's with President Qin, they seem very harmonious. Could it be that his target has changed?" Yi Liangqiu looked at Qin Anlin and laughed. "You said he likes Anlin?" Linda nodded vigorously and said, "That's possible. I think it might be revenge." Yi Liangqiu knocked her on the forehead and said, "What are you thinking about all day?" Linda chuckled and said, "I'll go to the kitchen to take a look." Just as she was about to leave, Du Yuesheng saw her and his gaze landed on the white figure. He smiled and said, "Linda, you're here for dinner too?" Now, Liangqiu didn't have a chance. As a man, sleeping with Linda wasn't a problem at all. Of course, he didn't want to be with Linda or anything like that. After all, she was still too young. It felt like they couldn't talk to each other. She was just a little girl. However, it was quite interesting to tease her. Therefore, Du Yuesheng stood up. "Liangqiu, accompany Anlin. I'll go take a stroll." Yi Liangqiu watched him walk towards the kitchen. He turned his head and said to Qin Anlin with some bewilderment. Qin Anlin calmly put away the chess piece and smiled faintly. Du Yuesheng is also an ordinary man, although he doesn't think so himself. Didn't he just see Linda coming over? No. Yi Liangqiu shook her head. She knew about Du Yuesheng and Linda's night in New York, but she didn't know what happened after that. Now, Qin Anlin looked up and smiled. If Linda doesn't care, Du Yuesheng will? Trying to play tricks with a serious man was the stupidest thing to do. Yi Liangqiu said seriously, "Anlin, I won't let him bully Linda." He smiled and said, "I know, but Linda is a good girl. She won't be bullied. She's not like someone who would sell himself for $500,000. She glared at him and said, "Qin Anlin." They already had 5 children and he still brought it up. Qin Anlin was teasing her. He touched his chin and said, "It's worth it. 5 children, 100,000. Such good genes, it's worth it." She couldn't be bothered with him and went upstairs to change and prepare for dinner. Qin Anlin smiled and picked up the chess pieces, but he was quietly listening to the movements in the kitchen. Chapter 1888. Du Yuesheng walked into the kitchen. Linda was secretly picking up a sour plum tomato and eating it. Recently, she seemed to like eating sour food. In the past, she used to eat sour food, but now, she felt that it was especially refreshing. However, she was always a guest at Bossie's house, so she only ate 2 and stopped. Later, she planned to finish all of them on the dining table. The kitchen servants were busy. It was early winter, but they were still steaming hairy crabs. The meat was so plump that it made people salivate. Linda had been traveling for a month and had long missed eating fish and meat. She was silently drooling. "You look like you have a good appetite." Du Yuesheng leaned against the kitchen door, lit a cigarette, and slowly smoked. Linda was shocked. She turned around and said with a smile, "No matter how good my appetite is, it's not as good as Mr. Du's." She mouthed the words, "A man and a woman, 1 drink and 1 eat." Du Yuesheng heard it, and his fingers that were holding the cigarette trembled. Nonsense. However, after a while, he squinted his eyes. "Are you jealous?" When the servants were not paying attention, Linda secretly ate a small tomato. After she was satisfied, she slowly said, "Later, when Mr. Du is eating hairy crabs, remember to dip more vinegar in it." She showed that she did not mind what happened that night, so Du Yuesheng should be happy. However, now that there was no news on Yi Liangqiu's side, he was a little disappointed. Now, even if there was a young lady pestering him, it would be good. However, this young lady would rather eat food. She had no interest in a big fish like him. Du Yuesheng left in silence. Linda was a little gloating. Serves him right, he fell out of love. Even if he was unhappy, he could not use her as a spare tire. The young lady took the check, took the small pill, and did not serve him anymore. Linda was very happy and secretly ate 2 chicken wings. She happily jumped back to the living room. The servants also served the dishes and did not mention anything about Linda secretly eating. At the dining table, Yi Liangqiu saw that Du Yuesheng was silent and Linda was happily eating her favorite hairy crabs. Yi Liangqiu didn't even raise his eyes to look at Du Yuesheng. He thought that there was probably no chance. Qin Anlin threw a look at her, meaning to say, worry for nothing. Anlin underwent another surgery to reduce the swelling on his face. This time he looked much better. Therefore, in front of an old man like Du Yuesheng, President Qin did not lose face at all. Yi Liangqiu was actually amused. Anlin actually cared a lot about his appearance, even though he always said that he was going to the surgery for her. He casually looked at Linda and slowly said, "You told me on the way here that you wanted to take time off for a blind date. Your family is special, all right? Do you want me to help you find a few young talents in the company?" She looked at Qin Anlin. "You know the people at King Entertainment the best. Can you recommend a few?" Qin Anlin calmly peeled a hairy crab for his wife, dipped it in vinegar, and gave it to her. "It's from the company. I'm afraid Linda won't like it." Linda chuckled, thick-skinned. "It's fine if I look at someone." She listed about 5 or 6 young talents at once. Qin Anlin said solemnly, "I'll get Liangqiu to arrange it later." She was Mr. Ye's trusted aide. Even if others did not like her, they had to make Linda happy. As long as Linda was willing, she could have 5 or 6 boyfriends at once. Chapter 1889. Du Yuesheng's gaze was deep as he glanced at Linda. "You want to get married at such a young age?" "That's right." Linda smiled sweetly. "Does Mr. Du not want to get married? Or does Mr. Du dare to say that he doesn't have a woman by his side?" Du Yuesheng's gaze deepened as he smiled. "There was one recently, but he only slept with her for 1 night." Linda looked at the hairy crab in her hand and couldn't bring herself to eat it. He didn't sleep with her? Was he trying to threaten her about this? She didn't have a husband, so what if she slept with a man accidentally? However, she wouldn't let him off easily if he dared to slander her like this. Linda smiled sweetly. "Yeah, Mr. Du only stayed in New York for 1 night. There was drugs in the cup." "Oh, right, if Mr. Yi had sent Mr. Du back to the hotel that night, then—" She looked at Du Yuesheng innocently. "Little girl, I'll kill you." "Shameless. You slept with me and you still dare to say it out loud." "Say it, come on, let's hurt each other." Du Yuesheng was also shocked by the girl's courage. Linda was admitting that they had slept together. However, the girl was good at sowing discord. If Du Yuesheng were to say anything else, it would seem ungentlemanly. If she didn't say anything, she would be in a passive position. Qin Anlin didn't know about this at first. He looked at Du Yuesheng and then at Yi Liangqiu. Du Yuesheng smiled bitterly. "Anlin, back then, you were the one who entrusted it to me. You didn't forget, right?" Now that they were together, there was no point in bringing up old scores with him. Qin Anlin naturally wasn't in a position to bring it up. He was just thinking that if Liangqiu had gone that night, would she have slept with Du Yuesheng? The more he thought about it, the colder his heart became. If that really happened, wouldn't the one hugging her every night be Du Yuesheng instead of himself? Back then, how big of a heart did he have to entrust his wife to someone else? At this moment, all the conspiracies had left President Qin. All that was left was Du Yuesheng's failed attempt to drug his wife and ended up sleeping with Linda. Linda was a hero to the Qin family and King Entertainment. President Qin immediately expressed that he would reward Linda handsomely and find her a decent boyfriend to be her husband. Du Yuesheng did not feel good. What was wrong with him? Wasn't it because he liked a woman? Didn't he fail to sleep with her? Is there a need to do this? Moreover, this little girl had become a hero. He was the one who put in the effort that night. Linda snickered while eating the whole plate of little tomatoes and 3 hairy crabs. But it was a tragedy. She ate too much, and her stomach hurt a little. Yi Liangqiu looked at her clutching her stomach and said anxiously, "What should we do?" "You have to take him to the hospital." She looked at Du Yuesheng. "Yuesheng, why don't you accompany her to the hospital?" There are 4 children at home. Chin Anlin also looked at his wife. Didn't they just say that they would find a suitable partner for Linda in King Entertainment? Why was she still thinking about Du Yuesheng now? Yi Liangqiu's voice was very soft. Didn't we settle it together? I was afraid you would overthink it. Anlin's gaze just now was murderous. How could she not see it? But what she said now was just to coax him. It couldn't be taken seriously. Yi Liangqiu had a feeling that Linda really didn't like Du Yuesheng. She was a young lady after all. Chapter 1890. How could Du Yuesheng reject her request? Besides, he had slept with a young lady before, so it was only right for him to accompany her to the hospital. In the end, Du Yuesheng carried Linda into the car. As Yi Liangqiu closed the car door, she said worriedly, "Call me if anything happens." Du Yuesheng buckled his seatbelt slowly and smiled. What can happen? It's just acute enteritis or something. He's just a glutton. Yi Liangqiu smiled too. Why did she feel that Du Yuesheng's words were filled with affection? It was probably because he was older than Linda by more than 10 years and had slept with her before, so it hurt unconsciously. She pursed her lips and did not say anything. She closed the car door and asked him to drive slowly. After the car left, Yi Liangqiu turned to look at Chin Anlin and sighed. Do you believe that Yuesheng is Shangxin? Chin Anlin put his arm around her shoulder. I don't know if he is Shangxin, but Mrs. Chin, do you have to call him so affectionately? Yuesheng? She rolled her eyes at him. What else can I do? She put her arm around his waist and walked with him to the hall. I almost married him, and we called each other more affectionately. Just as she finished speaking, her lips were blocked by him. Then he carried her horizontally and said in a passionate voice, Yi Liangqiu, how dare you speak like this now? I think I need to teach you a lesson. She smiled and begged for mercy, but he still carried her upstairs. Just as he was about to punish her, there was a burst of crying in the baby's room. Yuqiu cursed in a low voice. I feel that Aunt Sue is the best. In the past, the couple was quite harmonious because someone took care of the child. They were worried about outsiders taking care of the child, so it was always Su Qiu or herself who took care of the child. Yi Liangqiu lay down and giggled. She wanted to get up and take care of the child. Chin Anlin reached out to stop her and said in a gentle voice, You lie down. You've been busy the whole day. I'll go. She reached out and hugged his neck. Should I wait for you here, or should I take a shower first? His breathing suddenly became heavy, and he kissed her forcefully. Little vixen, go wash up. I'll deal with you later. As he spoke, he immediately ran to the baby's room, wishing he could knock out all the babies. The 4 of them cried at the same time. It was a spectacular scene. At this time, Chin Anlin was a little regretful. Why did he have to have so many? This was simply killing him. It was so sweet. In the hospital, Du Yuesheng kept hugging Linda. The girl, who used to have a fierce mouth, kept complaining of pain at this moment. She was extremely delicate. Du Yuesheng brought her to do a blood test, but was unable to put her down. He frowned and said, Are you certain that you'll be able to take me down just because we've slept together once? But Linda weakly buried her head in his arms. If it weren't for my lack of strength, do you think I would want you to hug me? He acted as if he was going to put her down and coldly snorted, Then why don't you find a talented young man in the company to carry you? Linda immediately hugged him tightly and complained, Yes, you're old and can't carry me anymore. This was simply challenging a man's bottom line. Du Yuesheng's face darkened, and he said word by word, That night, who was the one who cried and said that she couldn't take it, that it was so painful, and that she would die if she did it again? Linda looked around. This old thing really dared to say it. She bit her lip. That's because you took the medicine. You're tuning in to the Dreamy Chapters YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.